I'd like to call this session back to order. Yeah, say thank you for letting me do that. And I believe we are back to the two-year committee reports. And I believe we are at Ed Ready. Are we at Ed Ready? Yes. Thank you. I'm still booting up here. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Seck.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to a generous gift from the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation to the University of Montana, the state of Montana, under the leadership of Bob Curry and the Montana Digital Academy, has been in the process of implementing the use of Ed Ready across the state of Montana at both the secondary level and the post-secondary level. We have some very exciting news to share with the board today with respect to this work. I'm going to begin with an introduction of Dr. Ryan Schrenk, who is the program manager for Ed Ready. He will provide you with an overview of the dramatic growth which has occurred across the state in the past 12 months with Ed Ready. And then I will introduce to you, or I'll introduce him now so he's ready to go, but Dr. John Matt, who is the chairman of the Department of Educational Leadership at the University of Montana. He is with us today because the Commissioner's Office has contracted with Dr. Matt's department and his entire faculty to conduct research about the success of the Ed Ready students. In particular, he will be talking about the fall cohort, post-secondary Ed Ready cohort, and the work that they're going to be doing in researching the success of those students as they have moved into spring semester. He will also be talking about phase one of their research, which is the Ed Ready pilot. So at this point, I will ask Dr. Schrenk to begin the presentation.
There's that on. Thank you. Mr. Chair, Board of Regents, very happy to be here today. The two-year mission and the discussion about dual enrollment and all those things have a very close place in my heart with my past work at the two-year level. And I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about the slides that we have for you, but then also to give you a little bit of background on how that expansion over the last year has impacted the students around our state. First off, some of the timeline and things that we've been going through since the late spring and early summer of 2013. We were one of 5 states nationally to pilot the Ed Ready program with a project called NROC. And the NROC project is a nationwide group that's member-driven, and they fund open educational research or open educational resources for schools and educators from around the nation. And as a part of that, then, what we've been able to do through the Digital Academy and through the guidance of our board, we've been able to bring that to our state and fulfill our mission, which is supplementing education in our state with opportunities like Ed Ready. And Ed Ready, just to give you the 30-second view, is made up of 2 pieces. It has an individualized assessment tool that we can narrow in scope to answer the question, what do I want my students to be ready for? And if that question has anything to do with topics in relation to math skills between basic arithmetic up through pre-calculus with a couple of other things sprinkled in there, we can help design customized goals by what we have brought to Montana for our schools. And that's what we're doing with our secondary schools, post-secondary schools, and adult basic education programs around our state. And so with the gift, we've been able to do that. And creating these custom goals, the assessment is the first piece. The second piece, which is even more important that our teachers take advantage of then, are the customized learning resources that are delivered to those students to address the competency-based gaps that are opened up and shown through that assessment process. And very exciting program, and it changes the dynamics of those classrooms. And we'll share some data on some of the impacts that we've been seeing early on, along with the anecdotal data and feedback that we've been getting from students and teachers from around the state. So we have grown to serve all of these in the first year. And to break down some of the numbers as we're seeing them, and again, this slide is a week old, so it's out of date. We're over 8,500 enrollments as of yesterday when I left the office. And we're starting to see the impact and the integration of the program across a lot of different levels. The primary use cases within 2-year, 4-year high school, middle school, and adult basic education programs break down in this manner. We see co-curricular or supplement to the classroom. We had a group in our state last week from the NROC project going around, and they interviewed 46 different individuals from the Bitterroot Valley and Missoula area all the way to Glendive, with stops in Anaconda, Butte, Bozeman, Hardin, and several places in between. And so they're getting out, and I'm hoping to have that 8 or 10 minute video that's captured out of those to be able to tell our story from their perspective. So it's not just me standing up and saying that this program is a good idea, but we hear it from the people that are being impacted most. The other piece is what we reported on to you last year when we came in and we talked about that pilot program that we were in, and that it was being replicated last summer in multiple universities and colleges. The outside of the classroom prep of getting them ready for something before they take it. We heard the report from the math folks earlier. The research shows us we need to lessen that time to degree. We need to do it rigorously. We need to give adult learners control over their pace, place, and time of learning in order to motivate them. That's what this program is doing, but we don't do it without the guidance of good educators as well. It's delivered in a blended learning approach, and so they're using what goes on the computer to inform what goes on in their classroom, and they're using what goes on in their classroom to have the students sit down at that computer with a plan. And that's what good educators do with good technology, and it's allowing them to then approach these students individually. And a great teacher that I talk to on a regular basis out of Highlands College, Denise Alakovich, who's their math department chair, is probably the most articulate when telling me one of her stories in impacting students. And I need to tell just a brief story about visiting their school last fall. It was 10 below zero, or whatever the temperature is when snow gets squeaky. Middle of November, 8 a.m. And we were going to visit them and watch her go and visit her program to do some interviews about the user interface on NROC, on the EdReady program with NROC. And we walked into a lab at 8:15 in the morning, and it was clear full of students taking an introductory, it was basically a pre-algebra class, Math 065, if you will. One of the traditional classes that we see at the 2-year level with a lot of attrition, probably upwards of 50% in a lot of cases. That room was full. And the next class behind them at 9 o'clock was lining up at the door to get in to have the same class. And that was when I really saw some tangible evidence that this isn't just me talking about this is people making a difference. Now, those teachers had a lot to do with it in the way that they were structuring their class, because our program doesn't teach math by itself. But those are some of the stories that I get to see over and over again. That was maybe the first experience that I had when it was sit me up and say, wow. So just to kind of move forward in the slides here, we've got 2 more. This kind of shows you the map over time of growth, and you can see a spike start to, well, maybe not a spike, but we are starting to see a bump in our adult basic education programs. And we presented, or Bob Curry presented at their leadership group back in the fall as well. And now we have almost every one of their programs. We've entered into a collaborative effort with them to rework the high-set preparation assessment. It's preparing students that walk into their door for high school equivalency. And we had a collaborative effort from around the state where all the leaders and the directors got together and got an EdReady goal in place over the course of 2 or 3 weeks to respond to the increased requirements of that. And now we've gotten word nationally that the NROC folks want to post what that group created here in Montana on the national EdReady site to be one of the clonable assessments that other states can begin to use. So we're not just impacting Montanans, we're impacting other people, and other people are looking at our state because we were the first to adopt. If it's not every week, it's every 2 weeks, then I get 2 calls from other states that are looking to do things similarly to what we're doing in a supplemental nature. But we have the tool through the Digital Academy and through our relationships with our board of directors, with all of our educational partners around the state, to get this out quickly and into the hands of the educators and get out of their way so that they can teach math in a differentiated instruction or competency-based manner. So it's an exciting opportunity. And one other item that we're meeting about next week is the Healthcare Montana group. It will be meeting with us to go over what it takes to prepare allied health students for math in time for them to go into their programs without adding extra credits to their load. So I'll close with my final slide here. And I think we've gone through the skill recovery options and the companion or supplement options. But then we're also seeing a mixture of both of those things together, making a huge difference. It's making connections for educators that are providing interventions, as well as the first time through and teaching these basic math concepts in an adult learning-centered way, responding to their specific needs, and then allowing them to extend upon that in other ways and talk about the relevance of those math skills without having to focus on not knowing what they actually need to know when they walk into your classroom. So I'm excited to be here to present this sort of information. It's something that's near and dear to my heart as an educator and a teacher, and I just look forward to continuing this effort with our state and with the support of everybody out here in this audience as well. And I'll hand it off now to Dr. Matt with some of the findings from his research that he's been conducting for the program.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Mr. Chair and Dr. Seck. Back up one slide, if you would. Okay. As I said, my name is John Matt, and I get the honor of chairing the Department of Educational Leadership at the University of Montana. And we're really honored to have been asked to perform this kind of research. It's fascinating to us. It's game-changing. And before I go into the details of what we're doing, I want to share just kind of a quick anecdotal story of EdReady that's more personal. It's not part of our study, and John, it won't be in the final report. But my own son is about to graduate from high school in about 10 days, and he'll be a freshman at the University of Montana in 11 days. So in getting ready for that, I had talked to him and said, you know, he's a good math student, okay? He's going to graduate with 6 college-level math credits. Of those 14,000 that are out there, he's got 6. And we're real happy about that. That's a great way to go. But I said, you know, there's this thing called EdReady. And I had learned about it, studied it, said it may help you in ways that you don't realize. Why don't you at least try the assessment? And maybe for the first time in a long time, he did what I asked him. And he tried the assessment. I didn't know he had done that. He did that kind of on his own. And later it came to me and said, you know, it really identified some areas that were holes. And I said, well, you know, there's units you can go through that it will prescribe now that can help you with that. And 2 in a row, he went and did that. And what he said to me was really fascinating to me. He said, what it caused me to do, because of the way it's presented, is it caused me to do things very systematically in solving the problems. And now these are the higher level math problems. Very systematic way of solving the problems, and it wouldn't let me shortcut. It wouldn't let me shortcut. And he said, from that I learned how thorough I had to be with each step. And that I thought was really good feedback. And again, I'm not going to use it in the final report because it's purely anecdotal and he wasn't one of our sample. But it does give us some future applications for EdReady, and that maybe we could get an EdReady program for like vacuuming and dusting and some of the other skills that, you know, you really need that thorough systematic approach to. But anyway, these are the 5 researchers that are involved in this. Any true research, we want to keep things randomized, so I put us up there in random order. I had us up there in order by age, and 4 of them were pretty upset about that, so I went back to random. So this study is in 2 phases, and we are in the middle right now of phase 2, so I'm not going to be sharing a lot of data from phase 2 because it's still in process. But each phase has 3 parts, and the first part deals with self-efficacy. And in this case, that means the students' belief in their own ability to do a function in math. Okay, the students' belief in their own ability. And we're looking at all freshman students at this stage in phase 2, and we're comparing those that have been involved with EdReady with those that have been involved in traditional developmental math. And there's additional use cases that are now involved. Every time Ryan dreams up a new use case, our study becomes a little bit more complicated. But we have different use cases that will blend in there. We currently have 273 responses, and actually, this was a few weeks ago too, so we're actually up over 280 now responses on this, and we're still sorting out the data from that. We did the same thing at phase 1, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The second part of both studies, and this one in phase 2, is a comparison of the first college-level math course that students take. And we divide them into 2 groups, those that went through EdReady and those that went through developmental math. And of course, now we have additional use cases with blended. The data is collected at the end of the semester. Okay, my grades were due Tuesday. So it's going to be a couple weeks here before we have all of that sorted out. We have the students identified. It's just a matter of sorting out a rather large data set now. The third phase, or excuse me, third part of this is a qualitative phase. And we're going to be interviewing, or have interviewed in most cases, 1 administrator, 2 instructors, and 3 students from U of M Western, Gallatin, and Highlands. 3 of those are completed already. Highlands will be completed on the 12th of June. And our overarching question on this is, what is the lived experience of EdReady? What did you experience with EdReady? And these 3 different groups, students, instructors, and administrators. Okay, so phase 1. Phase 1 is completed, and the phase 1 of this study involved 37 students who were in the initial pilot in the summer of 2013 for EdReady. So this was a very small study, very small N. In terms of self-efficacy, we found no difference statistically. Okay, because the survey instrument we are using is a Likert-based survey, we used non-parametric statistics on this, a Mann-Whitney U-test, if anybody's interested. But we found no difference. But when we break it down into the type of questions, and the survey instrument is beautiful because it has a very clean break between basic math questions and higher level math questions. When we take only the basic math questions, we found a serious difference between the 37 EdReady students and their self-efficacy towards basic math skills than those that had gone through developmental math. We did not find a difference with advanced math skills, but I think it's a telling finding right there. Part 2 of this, again, is the comparison with first college-level math course. In here, we found some really interesting data. Bear in mind, we're dealing with a very small set here. There was actually 27 students of those 37 that went right into a college-level math course. So there was 27 in this sample. And the difference there, comparing EdReady with those that went into developmental math, was pretty significant. The overall GPA of students in developmental math in their first semester of college-level math was 2.34. The average GPA for those that had gone through the Ed Ready program was 3.03. So you're looking at a mid-range C to a low-range B, which is, when you only have a range of 4, that's a pretty good difference. We broke it down further by individual courses, and you can see some of those ends are very small. Math 135, there was one Ed Ready student that went into that, and they got a B. Okay, so it's tough to compare with those numbers. Math 121 seems to be one that people talk about a lot, the college algebra. And you can see the difference there is about 0.29 grade point averages, or grade GPA. Unfortunately, the qualitative part of phase 1 didn't work out as well. Of those 37 that had taken it a year and a half before we were studying them, they were less excited to come and talk to us. The qualitative piece in phase 2 is panning out very, very well for us. We've been able to work with the different institutions and arrange the interviews, and that's playing through very well. So I think at this point that is, or go ahead, there's one more slide. I think it can be safely stated that Ed Ready is having an impact. Okay, we look at the results from part 2 of phase 1, that's good information. We'll have a lot of data here very soon in part 2 of phase 2. Our qualitative data, I think, will give us a lot of information about implementation. Having done many of those interviews and unable to speak to them at this point because we're not through with the study, I think there's a lot of good feedback that we're getting in terms of Ed Ready. And I also, just on a personal note, appreciate what it did for my son. So we're open for questions. Ryan will take any of your questions. No.
Questions for Ryan? Yes, Regent Sheehy.
I actually have a question for you.
Okay.
And I know that I once knew this, but what is the relationship of Ed Ready to the Khan Academy?
I can't honestly answer that one. Ryan, do you?
Regent Sheehy, members of the board. Yes, we get that question all the time, and the easiest answer is integrated in with the Ed Ready education, or the resources that are delivered. Part of those resources have a live presentation with a speaker and interactive math problems going on behind them. Part of them also have worked examples, Khan Academy chalkboard-like worked examples delivered by Sal Khan specifically in that unit. So instead of going out to the website to view, or even to an organized Khan Academy type delivery system where you have to go out on the public internet to go browse to that, it's part of the integrated topic that's delivered, and it's tied in with a pre-assessment and a post-assessment that then refer into those delivery pieces to help the student go to the place where they could learn that answer correctly. So it's an integrated piece of it, and it was done before he was big time.
Okay.
It's done by him in that model, and was a part of the NROC Dev Math project resources.
So Ed Ready incorporates a little bit of Khan Academy.
Yeah, that's the shorter way to answer it.
Other questions about Ed Ready? Thank you very much. That, I think, one more example of the innovation, and of course, we have to thank the University of Montana for its leadership and the Washington Corp for their participation. And I think, thank you, and I think with that, and 2 hours late, I told you I was going to blow stuff up. With 2 hours late, I'm turning it back over to you.
Thank you, Regent Krause. Dr. Seck, thank you very much. We are now at that point, I guess we're at lunch on the agenda. We'll skip that item. We will.
You just
we will
never
go-
get enough to eat here, right?
That's right. They have a culinary program. We will go to the Budget Committee section of our meeting today, and I will turn it over to our Budget Committee Chair, Regent Albrecht.
Thank you, Chair Tuss. Members of the board, I would like to convene our Administrative Budget and Audit and Oversight Committee. Are there any items on the consent agenda that anyone would like to pull?
So, Yes, I'm unable to vote on the agreement for city water service extension. So if we could vote separately on that one, I can abstain on that one, please. I believe it is K, yes. Yes, K. So when the time comes around for the vote on that, not now, but for the vote on that, if you could separate that one out, and I'll go hide in the back or something.
So can we just pull K from,
Madam Chair, I think as long as it's just for voting purpose, we'll just leave it and deal with it tomorrow when the motion is made and consent. We'll
we'll
pull
make,
that one out. If
okay,
it's
so
not
we'll
for
recuse
discussion.
you from item K tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay, so noted. Thank you, Regent Kraus. Any other items that would like to be pulled from the consent agenda? Anyone else from the larger group? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to move on to the action items. The first item, A, is our naming opportunity, naming item. And I would like to ask President Ingstrom if he would like to, could you please give us an overview of this issue?
Yes, thank you, Chair Albrecht, members of the board. With your permission, I'm going to pass around 2 pieces of paper that I'll speak to in just a few minutes, if I could, please. Well, thank you for letting us come before you with a request for what I consider to be an extremely exciting opportunity for the University of Montana School of Law. And so as you see in the agenda item, we are requesting your approval to name the School of Law the Alexander Blewett III School of Law. Xander, as he is known, Xander Blewett, is a prominent Montana attorney based out of Great Falls. His father attended the School of Law, Xander attended the School of Law, and 2 of his sons have attended the School of Law. You may recall about a year ago, Xander Blewett made an $800,000 donation to the School of Law in the form of scholarships to assist graduates of Montana State University, where Xander had done his undergraduate work, to attend the University of Montana School of Law. That program is being implemented as we speak, and very exciting program. Xander and his family have now made a $10 million gift to the University of Montana School of Law. That gift is among the highest programmatic gifts in the system ever, if not the highest programmatic gift. The $10 million will fund a number of items within the School of Law, notably an endowed chair faculty position in the area of consumer law. It will fund additional scholarship programs, and it will fund a discretionary fund for the dean of the School of Law to use. Most of that $10 million will end up in the endowment, so this gift will actually come close to doubling the endowment of the School of Law. Now, board policy and actually university policy is silent on the topic of naming schools or colleges. There is a policy in board policy 1004.1 on the naming of buildings. There is a University of Montana policy 201.2 on the naming of buildings and facilities, but neither actually have an explicit policy on the naming of schools or colleges. The University of Montana Foundation, which is officially the recipient of this gift, has their own internal policy on naming opportunities. We recognize that that policy in no way binds the Board of Regents, nor the university for that matter. Those decisions ultimately are at your level. But they do have the foundation does have a policy expressing how they would communicate opportunities to donors and have those conversations. Although there isn't policy in place, we do have a number of precedents in the university system on the naming of schools and colleges. To my knowledge, there are 4 of those in place. The Phyllis J. Washington College of Education and Human Sciences at the University of Montana. The Davidson Honors College, named some 20 years ago now. The Skaggs School of Pharmacy, named 10 or 12 years ago, I believe. And most recently, in the history of this board, the Jabs School of Business at Montana State University. that clearly had a connection to a building as well as the school itself. So within the system, we have those precedents. The procedure then that we have followed to get to this point has been, as closely as we can determine, identical to the procedure that you followed in the most recent naming opportunity, the Jabs School of Business. That is, it has gone through the campus process up to the president's level and then brought to you as a board for action through the public process that you have. Now, I want to address a couple of questions. So one of the handouts that I gave you is a fact sheet on law school namings at other universities. This is not a comprehensive list. This is a list of examples that we wanted you to see, and I'll credit John Mudd for putting this list together. But you can see that there are a number of other very prominent law schools in the country that have been named for donors one sort or another. The University of Arizona, James E. Rogers College of Law. The University of Florida, the Levin College of Law. Indiana University, University of Maryland, one private, Hofstra University, the Morris Dean School of Law. And I would note, although not a public institution, one you may be interested in is the Anheuser-Busch School of Law at Washington University in St. Louis. So all of those gifts are the result of a donation of some magnitude or another. And you can look at the magnitudes there. They're listed in there. When you consider the magnitude of this gift relative to the size of our law school, the number of students or the number of faculty, it is larger than some of these gifts, smaller than some other gifts. So it is a precedent that is certainly in place around the country. So with that information, then returning to our process, I want you to know that the School of Law faculty voted on this issue, and the vote was unanimous to go forward with this naming opportunity. An enthusiastic unanimous, I would add. We then took this issue to the Faculty Senate, the entire Faculty Senate, University of Montana Faculty Senate in executive session, and the vote there was unanimous as well. And if you want more detail about either of those transactions, we have the chair of the Faculty Senate here, Steve Lodmill, and the dean of the law school, Greg Monroe, the interim dean of the law school. Now, what does this naming mean? It does not mean that someone else owns the School of Law. The School of Law is the University of Montana School of Law. It is the state of Montana School of Law. In no way does a donor in any of these naming cases have control, management, authority of any sort over the School of Law. That remains the prerogative of the dean, the university, the president, and ultimately you. The degrees that students who graduate from the School of Law receive are authorized from the University of Montana. The only authority that you have delegated in that regard is to the president of the University of Montana. Individual schools, individual colleges do not have authority to award degrees. So these degrees will still be the University of Montana School of Law, and in fact our diplomas say the University of Montana, Missoula awards the Juris Doctorate to Fran Albrecht, for example. Not Fran.
There's still time.
Maybe honorary. I want to speak for just a moment about the trend in naming on a national level. And so there's an organization, the CASE organization, the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. It is the organization to which foundations and alumni associations belong on behalf of their respective universities. And I'd like to read you just this brief paragraph because it relates very closely to what Commissioner Christian was speaking to this morning when he was talking about sources of funding in the future for higher education and the limits related to those sources. So here's a quote from this CASE organization. It's the case statement on private support of public higher education. Philanthropy has assumed a critical role in public higher education as state universities work to supplement income from their state's investments, students' tuition, and faculty's research support. Based on contributions from alumni and members of their extended communities, public and private institutions are able to enhance their budgets to fulfill their academic and public service missions. These gifts can take many forms, including unrestricted gifts, annual fund donations, scholarship contributions, and designated gifts for specific programs or projects, including naming opportunities. A large gift that names a program or school can provide funding for innovation and increase the institution's ability to attract leading faculty and students nationally. End quote. And so that is what this gift is doing. It's helping us attract leading faculty, leading students, and putting in place a state-of-the-art law education. I want to point out to you the second letter that I passed around, and this is a letter of endorsement by 5, not just one, but 5 deans of the University of Montana School of Law. Our current interim dean, Greg Monroe, who's sitting here, previous dean, Irma Russell, previous dean to that, Ed Eck, who many of you know, Martin Burke, who served as dean and just recently retired from the faculty, and going back to John Mudd. So all of those deans have, as you'll see in that letter, when you have a chance to read it, endorsed this wonderful opportunity. And I will add to that our incoming dean, Paul Kurgis, who will start July 1, has been very involved in recent weeks in these conversations and is enthusiastically supportive as well. So with that, Regents, I would ask that you approve this wonderful opportunity for us, and I stand ready to answer whatever questions you might have. And there are folks in the audience who I may call on if the questions go into a level of detail that I'm not able to respond to. So thank you for listening. I stand for questions. Regent Albrecht.
Thank you, President Engstrom. At this moment, I would like to open this up to my fellow regents for any comments. Regent Williams.
I have a question here. So you talked about the campus process and the faculty process, and I was curious if you could elaborate a little bit more to any other sort of stakeholder parties that were considered in the campus process. I know that you followed the process that was available to you, though it was not quite very detailed on our end. But I'm curious if students, alumni, or a law school advisory board of some kind, any other groups that were looked to for opinions on the subject beyond the faculty.
Regent Williams, thanks for that question, members of the board. If I could, I would like to call Dean Monroe up to maybe address that question. Greg, would you be willing to do that, please?
Chairman Tusk, Regent Williams, there were not other groups involved, and the reason for that is the negotiation of a gift of this size is being carried on right up to the last minute, and secrecy is a very important thing because I don't think we're going to expose the donors to all kinds of questions or getting a whole bunch of people involved in the negotiation. The responsibility, as we sat down and looked at the process that's required, and the responsibility for a gift of this size and for a naming opportunity rests with varying bodies, including this body. But I don't think the responsibility rests for students, and we couldn't see a viable way to bring the students into the process and get input on it. And we couldn't see how the students are involved in that. And I understand how that may look funny to students. But I think we followed the exact process that's been followed on all these other naming gifts. And it's a long-term process, as a naming thing is. And the long-term bodies that have the responsibility for making that decision are this body, the faculty, the university president, the university, faculty, et cetera. And for the same reason, we didn't think we could be public. It's a very, very difficult process to go public and ask for alumni input on it either.
Thank you, Greg.
Okay. Did you want to, President Ingstrom, were you wanting to respond to Regent Williams?
I believe that's what Greg did, so I don't
Okay.
need to respond further. I do know that outgoing ASUM President Asa Holman might be interested in speaking to that question. He is an incoming law student, and if that, Madam Chair, if that's okay. If you'd rather wait, that's fine too.
Certainly.
Madam Chair, members of the board. I am an incoming law student at the University of Montana, and I've also been extensively involved in student leadership on campus and a part of the shared governance model that works so well in our state. And what I would say is a couple things. One, I think that our system and my university, the University of Montana, does an outstanding job inviting students to be a part of the process in just about everything. But the fact of the matter is that students can't be a part of every single process, whether it's for confidentiality reasons or a litany of other reasons. And I don't think that not happening means that an idea is any less valid. So speaking as myself entering the School of Law, I personally would be honored to have the School of Law named after a gentleman who's going to give us $10 million, a gentleman who's going to double the size of the University of Montana's law school endowment, and a gentleman who I think any student at the University of Montana School of Law would be absolutely thrilled to emulate later on in life. You know, any one of us would love to come out and have the career that he did, and even the career that his family did. So I don't know the man personally. I know of his family, but I do know that it's a great honor, and I'm pleased, and I hope that you all will support it.
Thank you, Asa. Regent Sheehy.
I'd like to start by saying that I do know Xander Blewett, and I agree with Asa's comments. There isn't no man that I can think of that deserves this more. He's obviously a worthy person to put as a name of the law school. My problem with this is the process. We've talked a lot about what process has been used before and what process should be used. There's one process that has to be used, and it's the Montana open meeting law. The public has a right to deliberate when a public body sells a public asset. And every single part of this was done in private. The faculty voted in private. Those were deliberations of a public body, and it was done in private. The next faculty senate, again, deliberations done in public. Whether you call them students or alumni, or whether you just call them taxpayers, every member of our public has a right to determine what value to place on the public asset and when or whether to sell it. There are ways to do this, and I know it's difficult in negotiations, but you know, every public entity in this state does it. We all operate under this system, and we all need to operate under this system because it demeans the gift to do it wrongly. The way this could have been done, in my opinion, is for when the idea was first brokered, the donor would still have a reasonable expectation of privacy in his identity. You could have asked us. You could have had public meetings regarding whether to change the name of the law school in exchange for a sizable gift. The idea of if and whether that could be done could have been done with the anonymity of the donor at that point. There are all sorts of different ways to comply with the Montana open meeting law. But in this case, not just alumni, not just students, the public has been excluded from this process. And for 100 years, the public has paid for this law school. And although this is an incredibly generous gift, mind-bogglingly generous, the public has been that generous, and it's their name over the door. And if we're going to sell the name over the door, the public has a right to be at the table. I know that Xander has spent his life protecting consumers, and that's part of this gift, and I respect that. I happen to have spent my public life doing open meeting law, and this hits me where I live because I would love to do something wonderful in response to Xander's gift, but I don't want to do it in violation of the public's rights on this matter. I'm very passionate about this subject, both on behalf of Xander and on behalf of the public's interest in the name of our law school, because I truly believe that the taxpayer's name is over that door, and it should stay over the door. If you had done this in a process that I believe to be correct, you would have the opportunity to try to persuade me that naming of schools is a good idea. I'm not a big fan of this as a philosophical thing, but it needs to be placed in the market of public ideas and deliberated in public. I don't think that the problems that we've created can be solved at this meeting. While this has been noticed for 48 hours, that is the bare minimum. And the materials that were provided were not sufficient to give the public notice or even the Regents notice. I have asked for and not received the foundation guideline that was the basis for the amount. I very much want to see that document before voting on whether this is an appropriate gift or an appropriate consideration for the gift. I just don't think that the public hasn't seen the contract. It wasn't attached to the agenda. The agenda item was terribly difficult to find as a renaming, and I think it's very difficult to solicit public comment on 48 hours notice when most of us had to drive 8 to get to the meeting. So I'm not happy with the process, and I don't think that we can cure it today. I think that this needs to be noticed up. I think it needs to be a matter of public debate, and I think the law school needs to be named by the people of the state of Montana. And if they choose to name it after Alexander Blewett III, that would be fantastic, but they haven't been at the table.
Thank you, Regent Sheehy. Other comments from the board? Regent Johnstone.
Thank you. Let me preface my comments by disclosing that my son is a professor at the University of Montana Law School, and at least based on my understanding of the gift, I don't think either he nor I have any expectation that he'll be a direct beneficiary. He teaches constitutional law, not consumer law. But I wanted to disclose that interest. I don't think it's disqualifying. Martha's comments are particularly significant because of her knowledge and expertise in this area. But I want to set the process question aside for the moment. And I do think it might be a good idea, Chair Tuss, to inquire of our lawyer as to the process that was followed in terms of the open meeting laws. I believe that first of all, it's a very substantial gift. It's a generous gift. I think it is very, very important for us to be open to these. The cost of higher education and our ability to fund it is constantly under strain, as we've seen in the past few years, and as we'll talk about when we talk about the budget for next year. So it's very, very important that we be open to private philanthropy, whether or not that needs to carry with it certain naming rights, I think, can be debated. But I think the law school, I wouldn't substitute my judgment for the judgment that the law school has made. It seems to me that it's been carefully considered. So I would, apart from the question of being assured that that we're in compliance with open meeting laws, I will support this.
Thank you, Regent Johnstone. Other comments from the board? Regent Robinson.
Thank you, Chair Albrecht. I have a question for President Engstrom, and I was curious about again, related to the process of actually meeting and discussing this with the donor, and certainly you don't have to go through the whole history of that, but I'm just curious about the choice to name a school as opposed to name a building. I know certainly there's been other times where this has been brought forward to name one of the campus buildings after a donor, and what was the process to determine in this case that it was naming the school?
Regent Robinson, members of the board, the school has been bought and paid for a long time ago. sorry, the building was bought and paid for a long time ago. And so we were not in the process of soliciting funding for a building. We were in the process of looking for funding for programmatic aspects of the School of Law. So while I believe in the early stages there were conversations about the building, the conversation moved very quickly in a direction of programmatic offerings and a gift of a magnitude that would transform the programmatic offerings of the institution. I think that if you look at the buildings, and I guess I can't say this exclusively without a little further study, but the buildings or the facilities that have names of donors on them are donors who contributed to those buildings. So the Payne Family Native American Center, for example, that was a donation to build that building. The recent Washington Grizzly Champion Center that you folks have approved, that money was donated to build that facility and so on. And I think I'd have to go back and look at all of the named buildings, but I think that plays out pretty much all the way through. So we were just not at a point where we were raising money to pay for a building. So it turned to a programmatic conversation, and that took the level of the gift to a very different level, in fact.
If I could follow up with another
Absolutely.
question, Madam Chair. I'm curious about the endowment. This sounds like, if passed, it would almost double the endowment there. One question is, what is the endowment used for? How is it utilized? Secondly is, you'd mentioned that some of the donation, the $10 million, would be used towards scholarships, and I'm curious how much of that would be used towards scholarships.
Okay, so Regent Robinson, members of the board, Greg, I may need your help in the exact amounts here as we go forward. But the endowment, the existing endowment that's already in place in the law school, if that's what you're asking about, some of that is used now for scholarships. Some of it is used for a dean's discretionary account that perhaps is used for summer faculty research stipends, those kinds of things. And certainly some special opportunity funds to help students do special projects or go off to meetings, things like that. Sort of the usual range of opportunities coming from endowments. This new gift, a major piece of the endowment, roughly $3 million, will go to fund the chaired position in consumer law. So the spin-off, the 4.25% payout from about $3 million will help pay the salary of a new faculty line. And then another piece of it, multi-million-dollar piece, will pay for scholarships, again, at the payout rate of 4.25%, which is standard for our endowments. And then the opportunity fund as well. Some of the $10 million will be spent as current funds, but the bulk of it is aimed at endowment spending. Does that provide you the answer that you need? Thank you.
Regent Sheehy.
I've already talked about the process, and I'll move on to the content.
Okay.
Is there someone here who could speak to the foundation guidelines that are given to donors and were given in this case?
Regent Sheehy, members of the board, John Mudd is here, who is works for the University of Montana Foundation, and his assignment is the School of Law. So maybe, John, you're the one, and could you maybe ask him specifically what you want to hear? Thank you.
I saw in the paper, and I learned from you, that there's a foundation guidelines with price tags on various naming opportunities as starting points. Is that correct?
Apologize. There are guidelines that are developed between the university and the foundation for a guide to look at what certain things that the foundation does would cost. For example, if you wanted to create a scholarship fund and you wanted to endow that scholarship and have that scholarship be named, it would cost $25,000. That's a university and foundation range. If you'd like to do a current funded scholarship, it's $1,000 a year with a 4-year commitment. That goes on up the line. When we look at an endowed chair, as President Engstrom alluded to, you take a calculation based upon what the expected payout 4.25% is and what your salary and your benefit range is going to be, and then you sort of have a guide. We look at about $3 million off the top of my head. I don't have those with me. As a guide. Now, if you want to say, I want to hire somebody away from another law school who's very prominent, it's probably going to be more than that. As you go on up, then they look at, you've got distinguished lectureships, professorships, distinguished professorships. And so we have sort of a range that we look at in terms of what the output is on something like that. And in the realm of schools, then you begin to look at, subtract out salaries, look at your operating budget, and my recollection is it's $10 million or the operating budget, whichever is more. And in this case, the operating budget of law school, when you take out salaries, is frankly not very significant, and the $10 million seemed like a range. Now, that alone doesn't set up what you decide to do it. You look at some of these other gifts. I think the chart that has been passed out shows you that if you were to calculate that on a per student basis with some of these other similar gifts around the country, you would say you're right in line with what that is. So it all goes into that, and ultimately you all make that decision. But that's sort of the guides, if that's helpful.
It is. I'd like to see the guidelines.
Sure.
My concern is, and this concern was raised by a taxpayer, I found an old guideline from somewhere in the 90s, and it lists school or college, and back in the 90s that was 3 to 6 million. Program was 1 to 5 million. Unrestricted operating fund was 10,000 to 1 million. Scholarship fund was 150 to 500,000, and an endowed chair was about 1.5 million. That was 20 years ago, I think. In this gift, there are already 4 naming opportunities that have been exchanged. One is the Blewett Endowed Chair for 3.5 million. That's named. That's about the range, I'm suspecting, of what you get for naming an endowment under that list. Am I?
That would be, normally you'd probably be in that range, yes, that's correct.
And we got the Blewett Consumer Law and Protection Program Fund, which is 2.7 million. The Blewett Scholarship Matching Fund, which is 1.5 million. And the Blewett's Discretionary Dean Fund. So it sounds to me like within this gift, we've already purchased the naming rights to 4 things, and that they add up. I think the 10 million is gravy. I mean, not that I'm scoffing at 10 million, but am I going to review this, we approve it, and then somebody says, this didn't actually meet with the policy that you said you based this on because you double dipped?
Regent Sheehy, if I might, I'd like to correct you on 2 items. Number 1 is it's an Access to Legal Education Scholarship Fund. It's not the Blewett Scholarship Fund. They did give $800,000 previously that is included in this gift that is a Blewett Scholarship Fund. But the $1.5 million fund is set up as an Access to Legal Education Scholarship Fund to help graduates of Montana universities and colleges and otherwise Montana residents attend law school. And the Dean's Discretionary Fund is simply that, a Dean's Discretionary Endowed Fund, which provides much-needed flexible operating capital for a dean. So I just wanted to correct you on that piece of it. So.
Are you ready to correct the contract? The contract names those after Mr. Blewett.
Okay, I'm mistaken if that's the case then, Regent Sheehy, because my recollection is the scholarship fund was called the Access to Legal Education Scholarship Fund.
There are 4 things named in the contract,
Okay.
and they're named.
Well, then
With the
I'll
dollar
stand corrected, Regent Sheehy.
And I think that's a point. This is why I'd like to see the guideline, because I think someone's going to ask you for the guideline after the fact, and I don't want to look like we didn't do our due diligence, because the contract says that.
Well, I stand corrected, then I apologize.
I'd sure like to see that guideline.
Regent Sheehy, we can certainly get that emailed up to us. That it's a recent document that the University of Montana Foundation and the university agreed upon several months ago, prior to this surfacing at all. And so the numbers in it are updated from what you have read there, obviously, from 20 years ago. And so we'll be pleased to get you that
And President
sometime during the
Engstrom,
course of today.
I can see why you would use that document, and I could see why you'd have guidelines so that there's some uniform system. But what needs to be pointed out, needs to be understood, is that most of those things on that list, except the names of the schools, are newly created things. Either, the cost for a new building, the rule of thumb is 50% of the cost of construction. So that's a newly created thing that wasn't named before.
Correct.
The endowed chairs are newly created. They weren't named before. So we're not transferring a property interest that's already in existence. But with respect to the name of the school, it's already in existence as, and has been for 100 years, the University of Montana School of Law. So we're transferring what appears to be a property interest. And that's how that point of that differs from the rest of the things on the list, and that's what I think triggers your obligations under the open meeting law.
Madam Chair, could I
Absolutely, go ahead.
respond? Regent Sheehy, members of the board, I am not a lawyer, so we'll have to have people who know more about this than I respond. But we are not transferring ownership of the School of Law. The
No.
University of Montana, the state of Montana, still owns the School of Law. Xander Blewett does not own the School of Law. It is called the Xander Blewett School of Law. So all of the applicable laws, regulations that apply today will still apply to that School of Law tomorrow.
I understand that, but I think we're attaching a value to the property interest that is the name.
I agree with you there.
And I think that
It's a value of about
it's a-
$10 million.
Yeah. And I think part of that is eaten up by the other naming opportunities within the contract.
Clarification, Regent Sheehy, what are you, as I'm looking at the explanation, what else are you looking at that actually has those names attached within? Because all I'm seeing,
Do you have the contract, the 9-page contract?
no, I don't.
I'll give it to you. Mine has some phone numbers on it.
Commissioner Christian.
Madam Chair, so I guess a couple thoughts I have, and then I would like to ask our Chief Legal Counsel to come up and give us some opinions on the process, the guidelines. I guess the only thing I would share with the board, and this is, I too am not an attorney, simply sharing my opinions, my thoughts on this, but the guidelines, the process leading up to them, the ultimate naming authority is the Board of Regents, and it's the board policy and the board's discretion and the process that the board uses that I believe comes into play. I mean, frankly, I don't want to demean those, but the foundation, separate entity, they can do whatever they want and they can follow whatever guidelines they want. They have no authority to name the property. So the meetings they've had, whether you consider them secret or legwork or groundwork or whatever we want to call them, that is leading up to what I believe is a proposal being made to the Board of Regents. And I don't believe that the guidelines or any of what that we're talking about in that conversation are overly applicable, because that's what they're trying to do, to present an opportunity to you as the board. The ultimate authority, I believe, is the Board of Regents. And then you get to the process that the board used. And I would say that process has been open, and it is the process that we use on nearly every item that is posted. We posted an agenda. We believe that agenda should be posted at least 48 hours. We've generally made changes in the agenda up to that time. In this case, I'm not splitting hairs, Regent Sheehy, but it is more than 48 hours. It's been posted for about 5 days as an item that was going to be taken up. The name has actually been made public for about 3 days. But that's consistent with what we generally do. So I don't want to confuse what the foundation may have done or the law school may have done with what I believe is the board program, the board policy, and the process that we've used. I think that the item has been presented, it's been noticed on a public meeting. I will tell you from a number of years here, when there's items that interest people, I'm not sure how they do it, but they tend to find it on our agenda, and they show up in groves when they're passionate about it, and that's the way it should work. But it is now public, and I don't believe that anything we've done as a board has been in secret. We're bringing it now. We've put it on the agenda. We've made it public. We're having that discussion, that debate that you talk about, that the public's entitled to now. And you know, it's the prerogative of the board. If we as a collective body, you all as voting members of this collecting body, don't feel like that you've had sufficient time, then I understand that. And that can be a request that's made. But this is, in my opinion, the process that we use. We give notice. We have public debate. The public is involved in this. The public has a right to be here today. The public has a right to participate. And so the groundwork that's happened up to this point, although relevant, it has no binding characteristic whatsoever on what the board does or what the board does representing the public's interest in this. So I don't know enough about it, but that's my take on it. I'd like to get Viv to comment as well if we could, and try to answer your process questions.
Thank you. Viv Hamilton? Or Viv Hamill?
I'll answer to anything Regent Albrecht. I'm pretty used to being called all kinds of names. Good afternoon, Viv Hamill, Mr. Chairman, members of the Board of Regents. Just a few points, and Martha is certainly an expert in this area of law, and I respect that. The open meeting law itself has no explicit notice requirement. The notice requirement is actually implied in the public participation section of the law. And the only guidance we have on what's proper notice or not are two items. One is an Attorney General opinion from our esteemed and unfortunately late Attorney General, Joe Mazurek. And in his 1998 Attorney General opinion, he said that 48 hours is probably the minimum threshold to properly notice an item on an agenda. The Montana Supreme Court, in a case called Jones versus Missoula in 2006, said, notice requirements for public participation on a matter of significant concern to the public are unique to the circumstances. 48 hours might be just fine for most things, and in some circumstances, less than 48 hours may be appropriate. The Board of Regents, some time ago, using that guidance, put in Article 5 of its bylaws a minimum requirement of 48 hours. The board did not violate the guidance we have from the courts and the AG and followed its own bylaws in giving 48 hours notice. Now, having candid discussions about financial and legal matters in a closed meeting is usually appropriate. The legal layout in this area of law is the public's right to know must be balanced against a right to privacy that one may hold and hasn't waived, and a right that the society as a whole is willing to recognize. Now, I would argue that candid discussions about private financial and legal matters that are only proposed would appropriately be handled in private. Others may disagree with that. I can tell you that some Board of Regents around the country do discuss these kinds of proposed gifts in private for a variety of reasons, not just legal and financial, but all the other reasons on why we want to try and get folks to give lots of money to our campuses. So in that sense, I don't think there has been a violation of any kind of open meeting law in closing particular meetings, whatever they were, to deliberate on a proposed gift. This board has not voted to, in secrecy, to accept the gift. Had this board hypothetically done that, the remedy is to void the action and hold a public meeting, which you're doing right now. So from my perspective, Regent Johnson, we have done nothing to violate the open meeting laws in how we've handled the process and followed the guidance and policies and bylaws that we have on this subject.
Thank you, Viv.
Any other questions?
Commissioner Christian?
I just maybe get some thoughts on, so back to my earlier thoughts, there is not direct board policy on this, but having said that, there's a lot of things there's not direct board policy on. I mean, there probably only board policy that, you know, describes to the T a very small amount of what we do every day, and other than that, we use guidance from the board. So it seems to me with the lack of a formal policy, as long as we're following a process that has some reasonableness to it and that we've used before, there's probably some expectation that we're on the right track there and we can do what we're doing. I don't think there is any policy whatsoever that talks to us about naming a school. We have some that gives us guidance on a significant space, and I think those add some context for us here, and I think that this certainly is something that should come before the board.
I forgot to say one important thing. There's a statute, 2025-103. It's a one-sentence statute, and it says the Board of Regents has the authority to accept gifts. And the conditions upon which you accept a gift, you must follow. It's a very simple statute, and I think that's the statute that covers this particular gift.
Commissioner?
If there's more questions, be glad to take them, but I would just encourage the board to look at its role in this process and what we follow, and not necessarily what others have done, given, you know, I don't honestly believe they have any authority to do anything. I think this board holds the authority to name.
Thank you. Okay. Regent Kraus.
Thank you. So I was so happy to learn that I'm now a graduate of the Jake Jabs School of Business and Entrepreneurship, that I had a tiger sitting in a recliner tattooed to my shoulder. But, you know, those naming opportunities are, and I've been waiting all day to say that one. And I don't mean to make light of it, other than, you know, we do get pretty serious up here sometimes. And my first thing I want to say is congratulations to the University of Montana Foundation and to President Engstrom and all the people that have worked on this, because I work in the nonprofit world and I realize what it takes to have these kinds of gifts proposed. I think what we're talking about as far as policy goes on the one side is a gift acceptance policy. That's what we call it in the nonprofit world. And it doesn't seem like we may have one here at the Board of Regents, even though we're authorized by statute to take gifts. We just have never really agonized over which ones we should take or from whom. And that can be an issue in nonprofits. And of course, the foundation itself is one of those. The reason I told the joke about my school of business, the Jake Jabs School of Business and Entrepreneurship, is, you know, it is a name. It can be an issue, and we've received a couple of public comments, I think, as commissioners or as regents on that issue. I come from a little different, I come from a local government perspective on the sunshine laws, the public's right to know and the right to participate. Those are kind of the way I think of it. And 48 hours is fine for the Bozeman City Commission, because people that are going to need to know that come from Bozeman. And we're going to meet in Bozeman, and there you have it, right? You can get there in 48 hours. We're up here in the Flathead Valley, and you know, if you found out 24 hours ago or 36 hours ago that your school was going to be renamed, you might, and you hold a regular job, you might have a tough time getting up here to participate. And I think the participation is the piece, right? The piece that the Board of Regents needs to think about. I would urge you, however this vote goes, to look at, because I've thought about it before. I know, Clayton, you and I have had a couple of talks about this before. I would urge you to consider Regent Sheehy your conscience when it comes to open meeting law. Go in the future, right? And to maybe think about how you approach open meeting laws in the future. It's not so much a legal interpretation as it is. It really is. It is one of those things: the right to know and the right to participate. Right? Think about those and what we're doing today and where we are and how big a state we are and when people knew about the name and everything else. So that's a piece. The piece about whether or not you want your school to be named, I guess, although it was odd to me to have that renaming. I think of the value of the Jig Jabs School of Business and Entrepreneurship and the building that goes along with it for the future cohorts and generations of students, right? And that's a big deal for me, right? That, in the end, when we're all said and done, that's what I think about, not whether or not we've angered some alumni or even made them go out and do crazy things on a permanent basis to their shoulders, but whether or not the future cohorts and generations of the university system, of students in the university system, will benefit. So that's, I think, undeniable that the $10 million gift will benefit the law students. That's a big one for me. I do have some. I have to think some more about whether or not. Well, I don't have to think any more about the naming opportunity, but I do have to think some more about whether or not we have allowed the public to chime in on this. We've gotten a couple of electronic comments. That's probably the only way someone is going to be able to participate in this meeting unless they're from the immediate area. My commission example, and I think just as a conscience idea, all of you in your minds thinking right to know and participate, whether or not we've done that here or not.
Thank you, Regent Krause. Commissioner Christian?
Madam Chair, Regent Krause, I don't disagree at all. And in fact, I hope I said earlier, I appreciate that part of the argument. I just want to be careful with the language that we use around it, because if we think that 48 hours that's prescribed in our own board policy or adopted by our board policy is not sufficient, then I think we could address that. We could lengthen it. We could even vote to change our own policy. That's the right that the board has. And I'm fine with all of that. I just want to be careful that we don't make statements here in public to say that we're in violation of an open meeting law, because I think we are in compliance from a technical standpoint. The way we've given notice and the way we're debating the item. So I just want to be careful with the language that we use. I think there's a distinction there. And we may decide that for the good of the order and the good of the public that we want to allow some more time. And if that's the will of the board, I'm fine with whatever direction we go. I just want to be careful in how we say that.
It does sound like the board, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
It does sound like the board going forward does have a gift acceptance policy to hammer out if they so choose, but that does sound like something like from whom and, how you will consider from whom and to what ends. And I would urge you to rethink the sort of the strict 48-hour and to consider it in a larger context. I'll just give an example. I don't often use the local government example, but But, when we started going on TV, we found out that as a city commission, we found out that we had a lot more interest. And people wanted to read all the materials we wanted to read for some very bizarre reason. But, so we actually moved the deadlines for all submittals back a week so that we could put everything out on the internet, and they would have a chance to know about it and even ask questions about it before that Monday night. And so it was no longer, we got the packets on Friday, and the public could read it maybe if they inquired on Monday morning, and then, Monday night we made a decision, and hopefully they found out about it that 48 hours in advance, and that's in a local government. So you may want to back that up, the posting of all the materials on the internet a little bit. I know it's hard. I see Amy's looking at me over there. I know it is a very hard thing, and it was very hard for the staff and everyone to deal with. It still is to this day because you don't act as quickly. But at the same time, that sunshine law, that I think one of the things Montanans hold dear is that open government, that transparency of government, and it probably is worth revisiting those two things. So thank you for warning me about to take care with my language. I'm really talking about sort of, on a philosophical and bent there. So thank you for that, Clayton.
And thank you, Regent Krause, for assigning us a to-do list on your way out the door.
Just wait. I've got a list. Yeah, if you give me this thing again, yeah.
Regent Sheehy.
I want to be very clear that I don't have a problem with the 48 hours. My open meeting problem is this. Deliberations were conducted in private at meetings prior to this one. At those meetings, the public was not involved in two of the most important aspects of this, whether to sell the name and the amount for which to sell it. That came to us in a contract already signed by most of the parties except us, and we were asked to approve it. Those deliberations were conducted in private. Now we're having this open meeting. We're being asked to decide, was our notice sufficient with respect to hours? We've always used 48 hours. Was it sufficient with respect to notice? The public didn't get the contract. The public, members of our board didn't get the contract. And we don't have the other items that were deliberated upon by the bodies that made the decision. So if we're in effect reviewing those decisions substantively, that's fine, but we need to see the materials that were considered by that body. And there's case law in this. It's not of interest to anyone but probably Viv and me, but this is what happens. If the public comes to a meeting and doesn't have the materials that the board that's deliberating has, they don't have a meaningful opportunity to participate. So that's my concern with respect to the open meeting. With respect to what we're doing today, I feel like we're getting a finished product. I appreciate the fact that you put together these notes, and I wish I had the other information that was available, but these notes are one side of the story. They're the good side of, here are some people that changed their name. There are many, many schools that have chosen not to change their name. I know that California, Berkeley just did a long study and decided to take Bolt out of its law school's name because they think it's better to be the University of California at Berkeley than the old Bolt Hall. So they've taken that donor's name out. I know that the University of Washington chose to go with what seems to be more popular to me, the University of Washington at William Gates Center. The University of Oregon at Phil Knight Law Center. This seems to be, to me, the better trend and the larger trend in this industry. And I'm not a fundraiser, so I don't know, but I don't feel like this is a representative sample. And if this is really in our charge, what I'd like to say about the 48 hours is, it's 48 hours, but this is forever. The contract says in perpetuity. We will never, ever change it again. And if we make that decision, I think we need to spend more time on the front end really thinking about if that's the right thing to do.
Thank you, Regent Sheehy, and I would like to point out that I did have the contract in advance. I just didn't have it in front of me. Regent Johnstone, and then President Engstrom.
Well, I was going to make a couple of the same comments. We did get the contract, Regent Sheehy. It was posted when things were posted. And I also think the guidelines, at least I read some guidelines that were available, not the ones that maybe that were referenced. I don't want to extend this into a lengthy legal debate or even discussion, although I think your points are well made. But I would be surprised if the practice has been to subject discussions within our university system at the faculty level to the open meeting law. Now, maybe they are, I don't know, but that would be curious to me. I thought that, as you pointed out, that our responsibility was to comply with the open meeting law at our level. We get lots of information, recommendations that come to us that are a product of a host of discussions that occur in all sorts of venues, most of which I suspect are not subject to open meeting requirements. So that would be a little surprising to me.
You might want to look at the Crofts decision.
Well, if that's the law, then I think we should revisit much of what we do, but we'll see that. In any event, I would be interested in any further comments from the folks at the law school with respect to some of the comments that have been made here, particularly with respect to structuring the naming relative to the gift in the manner in which it was done.
Chairman Tusk and Regent Johnstone. The discussion started, and we were talking about ranges of gifts, and we did talk about the building, and we talked about, and we went and looked at the foundation guidelines, and discussed with Xander the range that he was thinking of, and ultimately came to the conclusion that he was willing to go to a $10 million figure. And frankly, we were exceptionally pleased by that. Then we started talking about what could be done with the gift, because it was a programmatic gift. And he did have an interest in, and he and his son Anders, and Anders in particular, had researched and concluded that a niche, something that isn't served by other law schools in the United States, that would be a unique program, is consumer law, consumer protection, and access to justice. So we began that discussion, and the idea was to put, and the best way to build a program is to have an expert faculty member in that area. And so that's how the endowed chair came about. The university talks about $3 million for the endowed chair. This one's well protected with $3.5 million. And then there was a discussion of a complete program or a fund for access to justice and all these other things that really serve Montanans. And that fund was put together at $2.7 million and funds a host of activities, publications, seminars, symposia, travel, student stipends to work in these areas, et cetera. And then the scholarship fund was particularly important to us. He had already given us a large scholarship, but to have a $1.5 million matching scholarship right now, when things are very difficult in the legal academy, they're difficult in enrollment, and to have that scholarship was tremendous. And so he did that so that it will ultimately result in $3 million in scholarships for the school. And then finally, having the law school discretionary fund, which covers a host of things. It's simply we have the discretion, the dean has the discretion to cover things like recruitment, placement, travel, and a host of other things. So we put that package together and talked back and forth, and those are the things that struck his chord, and he felt like he would like to do for the law school. And so that's how we ended up putting those programmatic pieces together and came out with what was, we think, a very, very nice package for the school. And what I call a transformational package. It just couldn't come at a better time. So I don't know if I've answered your question now or if I can answer more of the question.
The only other question I think I had is relate that then to the naming decision, if you could, to the naming of the law school.
It was from the beginning when we talked about naming the building. And we talked, and I think at the time we were talking in the range of $4 million running on the guidelines. And then we talked at naming the school itself. And he chose to go with the naming school itself. And this is a naming gift. I don't think anyone should make any mistake about it. This is not one where we had a choice to say, well, we'd like the $10 million, but we're not going to change the name. Very much, Xander was looking for the name, the honor of putting the name on the building because of his dad, him, and his sons. And we were interested in that. I mean, these are people, if you're going to put a name on an institution, you want somebody that's highly credible and that brings great integrity, and we thought that was there. And it was our opinion that people thought very highly, as you heard Regent Sheehy say, thought very highly of Xander Blewett. I understand that people may not want the name of the institution changed, but we've heard nobody say they don't want Xander Blewett to be the person to have their name on the building. So I guess in answer to your question, I'd say from the very beginning, it was a naming gift, and it is a naming gift. And it is my belief that that was what Xander was negotiating for, and that if it is not a naming gift, the $10 million donation would not be there.
Thank you.
President Ingstrom.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regents, I think we have, in the end, the opportunity to do a transformative thing for our students and generations of students in the future. In the process of doing so, we had at least two major responsibilities. One was to protect the privacy of the individual during the course of the negotiations, the sausage-making part of the process, and the other is to provide the right to know for the public. And just as in decisions you make about honorary doctorates or Regents professors, the process on campus is all done in confidence, and then it comes to you as a proposal, having completed that campus process, comes to you as a proposal to deal with in the public open law fashion. I believe that's what we've tried to do here, and I believe that in fact we have accomplished that. We protected the process until the process was finalized. Once finalized in our minds, brought it to you as a proposal. It may or may not be finalized in your minds, that's for you to decide. But as is our usual practice, we don't bring proposals to you that aren't final proposals in our minds. So I believe we've done a good thing for students here, and in the process have protected the rights and interests of both the public and the individual we're discussing. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chair Tuss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We did hear from the president of the student body. It's my understanding that we've talked a little bit about the faculty senate and their involvement in this particular issue. I believe we have the faculty senate president here. If we could perhaps hear from the faculty about this particular issue, if that's okay, that would be very helpful. And then perhaps before that, and I don't want to be redundant about this, but Commissioner Christian, perhaps you can also talk to us. We talked about 4 additional naming opportunities over the period of the last 20 years, some a lot more recent than that we've done, and how consistent is the process, because that's a lot what we're talking about here, is what we're currently doing versus what we've done in those particular naming opportunities. Perhaps we can hear from the Faculty Senate, and then you can answer that question. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. The UM Faculty Senate has an executive committee that's 8 members from across campus. And we were first informed of this idea, and we deliberated on it. We do have a member of the law school on the executive committee, and that member of ECOS was entirely enthusiastic about this, and we brought it then to Faculty Senate, and we did go into executive session because of an expectation for privacy for the donor. And I should mention that usually if there's any chance that something is controversial, even a little bit, it comes up in the larger faculty senate. We have about 50 members, and there are faculty members who do like to discuss things no matter what. And in this particular instance, we had the Associate Dean of the Law School, Professor King Reese, present the outline of this project to the Faculty Senate. There was some discussion, some good questions. There was a unanimous vote in favor of this. There was no significant squeamishness about renaming the school, and there was certainly universal support for Mr. Blewett. And so I can't really speak about the legalities of open meetings or anything, but I can tell you that this proposal comes with the full support of the Faculty Senate of the University of Montana.
Thank you, Dr. Lodmell. Commissioner Christian.
Madam Chair, Regent Tuss, so I suppose people can view things differently. Sometimes the lack of board policy leaves some to believe that we can do whatever we want. Sometimes not. And I mean, I guess the honest answer to your question is I'm not sure that even some of those naming opportunities that happened before came before the board. Clearly, I believe there's a board interest in this as displayed today. I think we're on the right track here. I certainly, as a former board member and in this role, have encouraged the presidents that these type of things definitely need board approval and need this process to happen. Some of those naming opportunities that you talked about that exist didn't necessarily come before the board. I think in the time that I've been here, we've really tried to tighten down and make sure that any proposal like this that has those lasting, that perpetuity word scares me too, that it's coming before the board and we're having a public process and we're given a chance to discuss that and ultimately the board can approve it. I really do believe in what I said earlier. The part that I really care about is what the Constitution says, and that is the board has full authority. And a lot of these other processes can lead up to that, but ultimately, I think the decision is the board's. And I'm very respectful of that. That's what I've asked the presidents to do. The presidents have been incredibly supportive of that as well. No one's trying to circumvent that. But I think the answer to your question is some of those were just named. And the sign was changed without board input. Certainly the latter ones and all those in my time in this chair have been in front of the board, and we've had a very similar conversation to what we've done now. And in fact, one of them, I think the Jabs building or the Jabs College of Business was actually named based on an earlier gift. And then when a later gift came to build the building, we went back and named appropriately the program and the building and sort of went back and cleaned up some past actions, if you will. So I think we're on the right track. I think it absolutely deserves this process, and that's what we're here for. But I can't give you an example of how consistent it's been over the last 2 decades, because it's not.
Thank you, Commissioner Christian. Oh, Regent Sheehy.
I think I'm probably the only one getting comments. I think we've all gotten 2 comments on the public email, and I've gotten comments from a variety of lawyers who are interested in this. And I will say that our comments, from my perspective, have been unanimous in 2 respects. Number one, they are unanimously heartfelt thanks to the Blewett family and to Xander Blewett for this incredible gift. But they're also unanimous in, I'm getting a lot of, please don't rename the law school. Don't rename the law school. Don't rename the law school. It doesn't have anything to do with Xander. And that has been sort of the universal response that I've gotten from lawyers.
Thank you. Regent Williams.
I had a question for non-philanthropic changes of colleges and within the universities, because I know that we do change the names of colleges within the universities, and I'm wondering what the non-philanthropic changes, what process those go through. Like, for example, the changing of, we can use the example, College of Arts and Sciences to College of Humanities and Sciences, what kind of process those sorts of changes go through when they're non-philanthropic, just as a comparison.
President Engstrom.
Regent Williams, members of the board, actually a fairly similar process in that particular case, College of Humanities and Sciences, that originated within the college. And so the faculty within the college took action on that, and that went through then the same procedure, faculty senate, provost, president, and brought it to you as an item that it's possible that was even a level 1 consent agenda. I actually don't remember, but it did come to you as an action item at some point. But the process was similar. I don't think in that case, though, there were any executive sessions involved because it didn't concern an individual. It wasn't an individual personnel kind of a conversation. Missoula College, I guess we renamed the Missoula College from College of Technology to the Missoula College, along with the rest of the two-year colleges, and that followed a very similar process, ultimately coming to the board for your approval.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Christian?
The only other example I would add, Madam Chair, Regent Williams, is the George and Jane Dennison Theater. Very similar. President served 20 years. There was a steering committee that was formed, and they met and deliberated on what might be an appropriate recognition and what building might be appropriate, and then it came before this board. Almost identical.
If I may, I'd like to make some final comments if there are no more comments. And then after this, I would like to, unless there's some objection, to open this up to public comment, and then we'll move on with the rest of the agenda. Is that acceptable? Thank you. I would like to note that I'm pleased with the fact that we do have a clause in here regarding termination of naming, and that's, again, nothing to do with the Blewitts, but certainly with regard to protecting our brand, as I call it, to ensure that if there is ever any tarnishing, and that should be especially with regard to any gifts in the future, and I know that that's part of protocol, and I'm appreciative of that as we look forward. I would also like to personally express my gratitude to the Blewett family for this incredibly generous opportunity, or generous gift and opportunity for students in the future. And I would just like to also caution us as we move forward with regard to the fact that being a person who has been in the field of development for many years, we need to be careful about making the process so difficult that it perhaps inhibits folks to come forward who may be considering making a gift. I might say that it's part of one of the reasons I might be cautious about running for public office. I think that there are certainly some real reasons why there's some privacy around that cultivation and that protection of that relationship when you are making those gifts. And I want to make sure that we honor that moving forward, as I know that there is a lot of respect and diligence that occurs during that period to ensure that all of the interests of that investment into what we believe is best for our students is ensured. And then I would also like to add that I think that, that participation point is really important. We do need to make sure that we offer that. And so I would say I am appreciative of this conversation. I think it really allows us to take a healthy look at maybe looking at that timeline and looking at the process and making sure that what we're doing is really serving the students and the future of our schools and the public with whom have entrusted us in these roles. So at this point, I would like to offer public comment, but I would defer first to Chair Tuss.
Yeah, thank you, Regent Albrecht. Let's talk about public comment just a little bit. I think we should, in the interest of the interest in this particular item, I think it's very appropriate to have public comment at this point, but I just want to remind the public, everybody here and everybody listening, that we will have public comment again at the end of today, and we also will have public comment at the end of tomorrow, like we always do. So literally from this point, we will have three separate opportunities for folks to comment, not just on this item that's on the agenda, but other items as well. So if you'd like to call for public comment on this item, it would be appropriate.
And I would just also like to respectfully thank Regent Sheehy for your passionate investment and your perspectives. I always appreciate having that on a board so that no stone goes unturned, so that we can make the very best decision moving forward. So thank you. I would now ask for public comment on this issue. Public comment? Seeing none, I would like to move on to the next item on the budget agenda, and I would like to ask Deputy Commissioner McRobinson to address the next point.
Chair Albrecht, thank you. In the interest of time on most of these items. I will try to make a few comments. I think a number of the items you've seen in previous meetings. We do want to make sure we have a full presentation of each item and be available for questions. Item B actually came to the board as an information item in November. Energy project that the Montana Tech of the University of Montana is moving forward with, has moved forward with, and they have come forward subsequent to energy audit with a proposal for construction amounting to $2.2 million, where the information that they have available would indicate that the energy savings in connection with work done on a couple of buildings on the campus will result in sufficient flow of energy savings to pay the debt service in connection with that $2.2 million. Chancellor Blackketer is here and will be available for any questions you might have. The Office of the Commissioner has worked with Montana Tech on this particular issue in terms of various discussions. They've also worked with the Department of Environmental Quality as well as the State of Montana Architecture Engineering Division. So the Commissioner's Office is in full support of this particular project, this action item.
Thank you. Any questions or comments regarding item B? Seeing none, let's move on to item C.
Madam Chair, this particular item also, the Office of the Commissioner has been in ongoing discussions with the Montana State University Bozeman campus on this project for really over a year in terms of looking at this parking structure. I actually personally sat on a committee that was involved in choosing the architect and also I think the architect for this particular project. So I have asked Terry Lease to provide a little bit of overview of how this particular project connects with the Department of Engineering, the new engineering building that is also moving forward. The board did approve previously project authority amounting to $5 million for the planning and designing of the engineering building, and that was approved some time ago. This particular parking structure is connected with that. So I've asked Terry to give sort of an overview of those and how these fit together.
Vice President Least.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Chair Albrecht and members of the board, and thank you, Mick, for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, so as you know, Mr. Norm Asbjornson provided us a very generous gift for the Norm Asbjornson Innovation Center, College of Engineering. And this is part of a South Campus project that is, Norm's building will anchor that project. And with the understanding that we fundraise for the other components and with the university support as well. So the garage is needed because the Norm Asbjornson Innovation Center site selection was right just south of our Student Union building, which is currently where we have our visitor parking as well as commuter parking on campus. So there's about 400 spaces that will be displaced by this construction that will be taking place, if approved, going forward. And so the parking garage is needed to replace those 400 spaces, as well as provide an additional 150 to 200 spaces for just the high demand that we have in that part of campus. So then, just to provide an overview of the project as a whole, after the gift, this board last March approved us to go forward with some design piece of the Asbjornson complex, and we sought legislative approval through the 2015 legislature for authority for $60 million. That was for the Norm Asbjornson Innovation Center, as well as two other components of the South Campus project, which are a plaza connector and a presentation hall for a total of $60 million, okay? You add the garage in there. A year ago when we first, were getting the gift and et cetera, you may have heard a number of 70 million in total. I know that was in the newspaper. We asked for 60 million from the legislature for authority. And so the difference being there's roughly a $12.5 million garage piece, which is a revenue producing facility. And we sought or are seeking authority for that from this board, from the Board of Regents, because we wouldn't request O&M on that building as we would the rest of the components of the complex through the legislature. So I know there's a little confusion about some of those numbers. I wanted to clarify those. But in essence, this parking structure, we'd want to get that going ahead of the rest of the construction so that we could get that in place so we wouldn't lose parking so close to the core of campus and critical spaces any longer than when we would need to. So I stand for any other questions that you might have.
Thank you. Any questions for Vice President Least? Okay, seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Move on to item D.
Madam Chair, item D is again an issue that has come before this board for discussion a couple different times. Here it is as an action item. This particular item is basically a student issue that has been brought forward in terms of really allowing the students to bring student-driven fees, and there is a definition of what is a student-driven fee within the changes in the policy. But to bring student-driven fees to the board on an annual basis, or to at least be considered by the board, the process would still require any fee increases to flow through the process for the campus, and when the fee would come forward, it would be coming forward on the recommendation of the campus CEO to the board. So I think with that introduction, perhaps questions for members of the MAS Association, or Regent Williams has also been very involved in the drafting and presentation of this item.
Regent Williams.
Would it be possible to invite outgoing and potentially incoming, whoever's comfortable, of the Montana Associated students to the table to answer questions or be a part of this discussion?
Certainly. Chair Tuss.
Up until a week ago, I thought this was going to be the hot topic. I'm pleased that MAS is here. This is one of those agenda items that I know that this particular organization, representing our customers, have been involved with for literally years. And so congratulations on getting to this point. Thank you, Regent Williams, for your leadership in getting it on the agenda. And I'm interested in your presentation about this particular issue, and once again talking to the Board of Regents about why it's here and why it's important.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. I know that we've been talking about this now, or you all have been talking about it for significantly longer, but have been talking with me about it specifically for about 2 years now. And so I don't want to belabor too many points that I've made time and time again, but I will once again offer to you that in student leadership, there's an inherent transitory nature. We leave office after a very short period of time. We are very often only there for 1 year, except for in rare cases. And most specifically, executives are almost always only there for 1 year. And so in that time frame, in 1 year, you have a limited amount of time to make a real impact on your campus. That's not to say that charging fees or creating new programs are the only ways that a student body representative can make an impact on their campus. But if a student leader does identify a problem on their campus, and if that problem has the support, or the resolution to that problem has the support of a majority of the voting students, then that student leader really owes it to their campus to bring it to this body. The way it's set up currently, we're not allowed to do that. We're just not able to. And the problem therein is that it sure is unfortunate for those student leaders who are elected during non-legislative years, during off years, because there's only a limited amount of impact they can have, and I certainly don't think it's fair to them to have visions or to have dreams or to identify problems and try and resolve those problems and not to be able to bring them here for the resolution. But more importantly, and what I think is really the issue that's most in question here is that students vote on their own fees. Those are the fees that they get to vote on. Other fees are imposed upon them after the deliberation of this body and the campus. And it's not that those fees aren't fair and they are duly deliberated upon, but the student-driven fees are the ones that the students actually have an active voice in. And so if the students by majority vote say that they want to levy a fee upon themselves, I think that they should have the right not to necessarily levy that fee, but to bring it to this body and make that request. And actually prior to that to the administration of their campus. Both the administration of their campus and this body have not only the prerogative, but also the obligation to not allow any of those fees if they think that they are an undue burden upon students or if they don't properly represent enough of the students. But to deny the students the opportunity to bring that forward, that's where I have the problem, and that's where MAS has tried to resolve this for so many years so that students can have that opportunity and students can be real members at the table.
I have a question. Asa, has there ever been a time when students have actually proposed to reduce or eliminate a fee?
Yeah, actually there has. The students on, I believe, Billings campus just, it was either Billings or, it was one of our prospective campuses just in the last cycle voted upon reducing a fee, but it was a non-legislative year, so that fee didn't come forward. And this year on our campus, we voted on reducing our sustainability fee. So yes, it can and does happen, although I would offer to you, like many fees, obviously, that's probably not going to be the case the majority of the time.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? I would just offer again that I think that the process that is in place that allows the students to vote, and then the fact that it still comes to us, and the fact that it's on an annual basis, really I have no issues with personally. And certainly I would encourage you to continue to look at sunsetting fees when possible, as it is our role to ensure that we are always looking at access and affordability. First and foremost, affordability. So any other comments or questions? Yes, Regent Robinson.
Madam Chair, thank you. I do have a question regarding the majority vote portion of the amendment. It sounds like what's being proposed is as long as that particular voting body, however big it may or may not be, if there's a majority of those that vote to have this, then the rest of the student population needs to adopt to that, and that's my question. Is that how this has been done with other things with student government? For instance, if there's, and I don't know what typically is a voting contingency, how large or small it would be, but that's one question that I had.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Regent. The answer to that question is yes. If the students, on our campus specifically, the University of Montana, and all of the campuses have some type of stopgap where they cut off. On our campus specifically, it's 12%. So if 12% of the students do not vote in an election, then all the results that are fee-based in that election are nullified. And obviously not the results of incoming officers and whatnot, but if a fee is proposed, and even if it has a majority of student votes, in fact, even if every single one of 10% of the population voted in favor of it, it would not be brought forward to the administration or to this board because of our own governing documents. In terms of if we meet that 12% number, and then there is a group of students on campus who have not voted, yes, if it was approved by our administration and if it was then in turn approved by the Board of Regents, that would be levied upon all students, but I'd offer to you that that is no different than any number of other ways in which we vote in this nation. It's the way a democracy works. Not everybody takes action in every single opportunity that they have to. I wish that 100% of our students would vote, but unfortunately that's not a reality, and I have to live with, and so do all the other student leaders have to live within the reality that we're given. If we are expected to know what every single student wants, it would be very hard for us to ever take any action. But I do trust that the administrators on our respective campuses, and most certainly that this body, is able to weigh the number of students who voted versus the number of students who are on a campus versus the amount of students who will be affected by a certain fee, and make that decision moving forward.
I do believe law school is the appropriate path for you, by the way. I've got Commissioner Christian, Regent Krause, and Regent Sheehy.
Madam Chair, I'd just say quickly that I am very supportive of this, and I'm probably one that I feel like I need to comment because I've resisted this some in the past, but I've probably resisted it for the wrong reasons. I much to that last conversation we had, the board's the final authority on this. This is a recommendation from the students, and I think sometimes it was easier for us. I'm very conscious of overall fee increase and what that does in the aggregate, and I'm very aware, with all due respect to the student fees have risen slightly sharper than our fees have. And I think in a way of kind of holding those down, it was just easier to deal with them, but on a biannual basis instead of an annual. But that's probably not fair to those students that come through student government and have things in front of them. And I just think the board's going to have to make tough decisions now on an annual basis instead of every other year, and that's probably fair. And this board is more than capable of that, and the options will be to approve the fee or not approve the fee or sunset the fee, or all those options are available to this body, and they can take those each time, and that will allow student government in their cycle to bring proposals forward, and we'll just have to look at them one at a time and do the right thing.
Thank you. Regent Krause.
Yes, I can remember voting no on a student fee, and it was because I disagreed with the fee. I think at least one or two other regents voted no because they disagreed with the timing. But it is, we're all, as you very well pointed out, I think, we're subject to the tyranny of a minority many times in our country, where bond issues and everything else get passed by a small amount of people, large or small amount, and then we're all paying them. So you see that all the time, and most probably, any of those referendums could fit into that, or law, or the kinds of laws that you see going out, not going through the legislative process, but going through the ballot. Many times those are similarly imposed, right? And maybe for better or for worse on some of those. So thank you for that. I will be supporting this. That's it for me. Right to say.
Thank you. Regent Sheehy.
Asa, you began your remarks by saying that 1 year is not very much time to get anything done. And I just want to point out that we've had Mariah with us for 1 year, and she got this done. And she rewrote it, and she circulated it, and she got all the troops together, the best troops that you could have. And I could get a little teary-eyed about how I'm going to miss my friend here. So I want to point out that this is her baby, and she's done a great job with it, as she has with every other single thing that we've addressed. So thank you, Mariah.
Well said. Hear, hear. Thank you, Regent Sheehy. Regent Robinson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was one of those votes that voted against it before too, and I'll certainly admit to that. And the circumstances were different, but some things are the same. I certainly like the process that this has gone through, just like any other process and decision that we have to make. Some seem pretty straightforward. Others require quite a few questions, and this was one of those that required a number of questions and discussions and meetings and effort. And I do want to commend the Student Senate and the Student Regent and the former Student Regent as well, who also had much to do with the discussions that brought it to this point. I think it needs to go through that process, because one of the things that concerned me then, and that still concerns me now, is what impact does this have, especially on those students? When we discussed this before, we were discussing the student debt that students have to carry. We were discussing those loans that students were defaulting on, and the rates of default, the cost of education in itself. And so I just don't want this to burden other students that may be struggling to really stay in school. So I think I just want to make those comments, that we need to keep those students in mind as well as we move things forward. So I'm certainly in favor of this, and I appreciate the effort that's been put into this, but I think we also need to always keep that in mind, and hopefully the incoming student senate will have those discussions on their campuses as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further comments? Regent Williams.
So I just want to thank everyone here at the table for having this discussion. This is something that has been kind of on the students' minds and kind of in the back of the board's minds and at the commissioner's office for a significant period of time. And I do believe it's high time that it was brought to the table. I'm really happy to be here to have this discussion. So I'm excited to see where the will of the board stands on it. I had something else, but I'll say it tomorrow if it passes. How's that?
Thank you, Regent Williams. Unless there are any further comments, I would like to move on, and we'll push this on till tomorrow for a vote. Back to you, Mick. Pardon me. Deputy Commissioner Mick Robinson.
Finally known as Fran.
Unless I'm out of town.
Item E deals with campus allocation recommendations. This is the allocation of the state funding that was flowing out of the just completed legislative session. If I could have you take a look at it, attachment 1, I'll walk through the information presented in that. This particular step in the process, it's really going to be a two-step process. And it's being driven by policy 970.1, which was adopted in March of 2013. So we utilize this process for the present biennium, the 2 years, fiscal years 14 and fiscal years 15. And so this is the same process moving forward. And so what you have in front of you is really more a mechanical process in getting the first step completed. The second step will be asking the presidents of Montana State University and the University of Montana to come back to the board with a recommendation of how the totals allocated to the two sides of the system will be allocated to the individual campuses, their individual campuses. So at the top of the spreadsheet or the presentation, you can see a total that comes from House Bill 2. There are certain elements within that total appropriation that are allocated directly. Yellow Bay, for example, the research unit on Flathead Lake, PBS, family practice residency funding. The residency funding is actually transferred by our office to the Department of Public Health and Human Services, where it is matched with federal Medicaid dollars, and then it is distributed by Public Health and Human Services to the residency program in Billings and the new residency program in Missoula. If there are new sort of line item or new program type appropriations within our requests that are funded by the legislature, we do also allocate those directly to the program or to the institution for the first biennium. Veterinary medicine program funding for MSU Bozeman is an example that is presented there, as well as new space appropriations for the University of Montana, MSU Bozeman, Montana Tech, and MSU Northern. The remaining amount, then we add pay plan appropriation in connection with that. It wasn't House Bill 13, that's a little bit error, but we did have a pay plan appropriation that we include, and we get down to the highlighted amount, which is the dollar amounts that will be allocated to MSU and UM. It is allocated by policy based on a 3-year average of resident FTE. So in the bottom half of that chart, you can see that computation that results in an allocation to the MSU campuses of 52.9% of that amount. There's an allocation to the UM campuses of 47.1%. Those percentages have changed from the present biennium to the upcoming biennium somewhat because the enrollments have changed. So the percentage that was associated with MSU campuses in the present biennium, I believe, was 51.2%, and to the UM campuses, 48.8%. So there has been an increase in the percent flowing to the MSU campuses and a downward movement in the percent flowing to the UM campuses. About 1.7% variance taking place. Also at the bottom of the chart, you can see that there is a certain dollar amount that is pulled out on an annual basis from what we call the lump funding of $300,000 that is labeled as Regent's priority dollars. And that amount has been consistent over the last several years. That is then available for use by the Commissioner's Office to identify or pay for any particular priorities that the Regents may be interested in. For this last biennium, a couple that I would refer to would be a $90,000 payment that went to EverFi for the videos that were used in terms of the sexual assault training and the alcohol use training and financial literacy training on all of the campuses. So those dollars may be available for system-wide issues as the board would see fit. And that was one of the areas that the board was certainly very much involved with. Another example is a software package connected with international travel, so being able to track faculty and students as they would be traveling in education capacity outside of the United States. That was another one that was implemented from a system-wide perspective. So with that, Madam Chair, we would be looking in this item for the board's concurrence in terms of, again, what is a mechanical computation at this point driven by a board policy to allocate that $172 million in the first year, $176 million in the second year of the biennium to the presidents. The presidents will be coming back to the board relatively soon, and we would expect that we would try to establish a conference call to make that final step and hear the recommendations of the presidents in terms of allocating those dollars to their respective campuses.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner Robinson. Any questions or comments on this item from the board? President Engstrom, would you like to help me understand what this process looks like on your respective campuses, how you take that allocation and the process to allocate? I see you've got your CFO here too.
Regent Albrecht, you're talking about the next step allocation process?
Yes.
So the finance officers of the 4 UM campuses get together and have that conversation. We have basically based that allocation roughly on FTE. Over the years, some additional money has moved to some of the other campuses for specific reasons. For example, the Helena College for many years had tuition frozen when the other campuses didn't. And they still had the extra expenses of salary packages or pay plans and so on to implement. And so on occasion, money would move to those campuses to pay for those expenses where they didn't have a revenue source. Last year, we undertook an exercise to see how our 4 campuses compared to their peer institutions on a per-student funding basis. As a result of that conversation, we made slight adjustments, actually very slight adjustments to the percentage distribution of the 4 campuses. And so then we'll just review that going forward. But I would anticipate that our percentage distribution in this next year, this next biennium, would be essentially what we've distributed, the percentages that we used in the last year.
Thank you.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, it
Thank you.
does. Did you want to comment, Provost Potvin, with regard to the process with MSU?
Well, I would ask Terry Lease to address the process that we use at MSU.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Albrecht and members of the board. Yeah, very similar to the University of Montana. We went through a process a couple of years ago working with the other financial officers and the chancellors and deans at the other campuses to identify, based on funding per FTE, et cetera. We actually went back and found a time frame, FY 2005 through 2009, I believe, was sort of a benchmark that everybody agreed to, that this was a sort of a right sizing of where we should be. And then over time, now that the folks who have gotten out of line, if they've had decreasing enrollment or increasing enrollment, we spread that out to gradually get us back to that point. So then longer term, we can use that model. And this is the model. It's a little, it looks complicated, and I bring that up just mainly for a humorous effect, but it's really just an FTE model along with individual campus considerations based on their cost structures, right? Because they're not the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Tuss.
Thank you, Regent Albrecht. Mick, could you go over with us one more time the region priority dollars? There's $600,000 over the biennium. None of those dollars are yet spoken for. Is that correct? Do I have that right?
Madam Chair, Regent Tuss, that is correct at this point, unless the commissioner has done something that I'm not aware of, which sometimes happens. There has been one discussion piece that I think I have pointed to, perhaps future use of those dollars, and that deals with suicide prevention discussion and perhaps seminar that we are looking forward to implement into the next biennium. That would be an example that would be a system-wide situation that may possibly be funded out of that source.
Thank you. I just didn't know if some of the priorities that we had identified and funded through this fund in our current biennium were things that would flow over into the new biennium, and we would use these funds for those same priorities.
Regent Tuss, one of the, I don't have the final answer on this, but a couple of the items that I just mentioned in terms of the software for international travel and the $90,000 per year for the EverFi, we believe that in terms of how we were able to utilize funds to cover those two expenditures in the last biennium, we believe that those have the funding for those will probably or are probably included on the base funding for our office moving into this biennium. So we believe that the continuation of the funding for those for the next biennium is certainly there.
Thank you. Unless there are any other comments or questions on this item, I'd like to move on to the next item.
Madam Chair, Deputy Commissioner Trevor will be leading the overview of this particular item.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, we have before you the request for approval for the FY 16 and 17 performance funding model. I want to try to make this as painless as possible. And in order to do that, I'm going to skip to slide 5 right out of the chute. Well, I meant 4. There's 7 decision points that the regents need to make here. I'm going to walk through them one at a time fairly quickly. Please stop me if you have any questions as we do this. The consequences of approving this model drive the allocations that will be made for FY16 and then in FY17. The allocations for FY16 are on an additional attachment that are basically hypothetical at this point, contingent upon your approval of each one of these points. You could change individual attributes of this and it would change the allocation. That would require us to come back to you at a later date. That's not a problem. You have full discretion here to question and change, and or you could just take our word for it. The Performance Funding Steering Committee, myself, the commissioner, have put these recommendations together, and we strongly feel that this is the direction we should go in. With that said, we'll go to the next slide. Performance funding pool. This one's not really up for much discussion, I'd say, given the fact that the language is part of our MOU that we have tied to the tuition freeze that would require us to put at least $30 million in the biennium into performance funding. That's $15 million per year. That's a doubling of the amount that we put in FY15. I wouldn't recommend, I would say we can't go lower than this because it'll break the MOU, and I would not recommend going higher as we have already are doubling the amount that we did last year. Next slide. The performance metrics, you approved these in 2014. I want to remind you of that. I'm going to show you those in a minute on another slide, but we made some slight adjustments throughout the year as we worked. We spent the last year working on the allocation model portion of the math within the model. And as we did that, we discovered some nuances that we needed to change with the metrics. Very small. They affected two-year campuses. We changed the measurement of retention from fall to spring to fall to fall in line with the four-year campuses. But also we had some smaller two-year campuses that were already at such a high rate that in the 85% range that it's very difficult to improve upon that. We also changed, we had a menu, we had a selection of 4 different metrics. They included transfer, and it also included another measure of licensure test pass rates. We just were unable to collect that data at an appropriate level that we could use in the model that reduced the choice in the menu down to 2, which you had to pick 2, so therefore there really was no choice in the menu anymore, and it wasn't necessarily a menu, but it was just incorporated these 2 remaining metrics, which were remedial success rates and credit accumulation. That's all that changes for the metric measurements. Slide 3, the weights on these metrics. So you can see the metrics now running down the left-hand column for each campus type. We produce an overall index score for each one of these metrics, and then we aggregate those scores, and they first have to be weighted. And if you remember back to the first model, we only had 2 metrics for each campus. In essence, they were weighted 50% apiece. As we grew the metrics by institutional type, we have to distribute the weight of those metrics. And as you can see for the flagships, we kept an even split between undergraduate degrees and retention rates at 30% apiece, and then applied a 20% to the graduate degrees and a 20% to the research expenditures. For the flagships, you also have to weight the underrepresented groups, which progress in those areas are used as bonus point add-ons, but you still have to weight them.
I have a super quick question. Sorry, I was just curious, on the graduate degrees awarded, on the 4-year regional, you leave out the graduate degrees awarded. I know we have graduate programs at the 4-year regionals. Can you just give me a 1 sentence why they're not included in the graduate degrees awarded as a metric for those underrepresented?
At the 4-year regionals chose not to measure graduate degrees in this first round. That may be something they choose in the next biennium. So you can look at the table up here and kind of get a quick view of how the weights are distributed. We think these are very appropriate. Each one of these areas, subgroups, reviewed these and came to a collective recommendation on this. Growth target. So we standardize all of the scores to 1,000 points. If you had 1,000 points after you measured all of your metrics, that meant that you stayed exactly the same and you did not improve. If you, we are recommending that we set a growth target of 1%. So campuses would need to improve in order to receive their full performance allocation. And we're recommending that that improvement be set at 1%. So campuses need to hit 1,010 in their standardized scores in order to receive the full funding allocation coming to that campus. So I provided a little example here on how that math looks. And for instance, if you were at a smaller four-year campus and they have only 2 metrics, if you grew your retention rate from 72 to 73, and you increased your number of degrees awarded from 290 to 300, a very plausible example, you can see how those are converted into a standard score of 1,000 and then weighted 50% apiece and then added together for a total aggregate score of 1,024, which exceeds the 1% growth rate. I see Shannon nodding right now. I just connected with one person, so. Next, the bonus point calculation. And you know, I can't help but chuckle a little bit on the complexity of this. And we always said all along, we're going to keep this simple. But by God, you couldn't do it. It has to get somewhat complex. The bonus point calculation. So let's go back to that last model we just did there. We didn't add in the bonus points. Campus now gets to measure for both of those metrics. You get to measure low-income students, you get to measure veterans, you get to measure non-traditional students, and you get to measure Native Americans. And you get to add for those groups, in addition to already counting them once, if they graduated in any one of those categories, we get to count them again. But we're not going to count them as a whole student again. We've got to count them as a bonus point add-on would say, okay, we'll give you a 0.25 add-on there. So if you were low income, you would count as a quarter of a completion, let's say. But if you were in 2 categories, a low income student and a Native American, very plausible situation, be the same student, you would now be counted as half a completion. And if you're in 3 categories, 3/4 of a completion, and very plausible, you could be in all 4 categories, you then would be an entirely added-on completer as a bonus to the previous calculations I showed you on the last slide. And so we're recommending, and when I say we here, for all truth in advertising, the commissioner and I are recommending the 0.25 level. He's surprised that I'm doing this because I probably didn't tell him I was going to. The performance funding, this is the only place that we are deviating in our recommendation from the Performance Funding Steering Committee. Originally, we had a 0.5 multiplier. So you could possibly count as 2 completions if you were in all 4 categories. It just felt like a better fit, giving more validity to the model to use the 0.25, given there's 4 categories. If you fell in all 4, it added up to 1. We had some.
How much does a change to 0.25 move the numbers?
The dollar amounts in the proposed allocations. It does not affect any campus except Billings, and as a result of moving this, Billings loses $250,000 additional dollars.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay, I'm glad I asked.
Next slide. Transitional loss zone. So, as a fundamental to this model, we don't want to take away a campus's complete dollar allocation if they missed their 1% growth rate. Let's say they got 1,009 points. We wouldn't want to say you went from getting $1.5 million to zero. Instead, we create a zone that you could slowly backs you off based upon your distance from the 1% growth. So you can have small declines in certain areas and still receive some of your dollars. And when I show you the allocation distribution, I'm going to use Billings as an example because they did still fall in the transitional loss zone and they did not lose all of their dollars. We had a similar zone to this in the last model. This one's calculated slightly different, but by and large, it has the same attributes. It's a very important part of the model, and whereas we only have, if you approve all of these different attributes here in these 7 decision points, we have one campus that's not receiving its full funding this coming year. I don't anticipate that would be the case going forward. We can't ensure that we wouldn't have multiple campuses in the future that don't meet the mark. We're struggling at times with enrollment that has an undeniable effect on the number of completions. So campuses are fully aware of the fact that it's a possibility they could fall into the transitional loss zone in the next fiscal year. Finally, the residual funds. So the residual funds, a good description of that is the funds left over after a campus doesn't, if a campus doesn't receive its total eligible funding. And in the first model, what we did is we took those funds that were left over and we allocated them back to campuses that did make progress. So we actually moved money from one campus to another. That was a big point of contention that we did not want to do in this next model. So what we are requesting and recommending to the board is that to use the residual funds like this. If a campus doesn't make its mark, give them the opportunity to write a very prescriptive, outcomes-driven request back to the commissioner's office to grant some of those funds to them to work in areas where they need improvement, to avoid the downward spiral of not receiving your total allocation and a hole in your budget and still trying to increase your outcomes. We think this is an appropriate mechanism. We have experience with doing this with veterans funds, with federal grants, and we feel like we stand ready to work with the campuses, and in this case it would be Billings, to do a very focused grant allocation to them to increase retention and completion. We would bring that request and model back to the regents for approval, likely very soon. We also need to be prepared for larger residual amounts that could be produced and dollars that bump up against the end of a biennium. Here we're requesting that those dollars that aren't re-granted back to campuses for improvement purposes be put in a board reserve need-based aid fund that can be carried into the next biennium and applied in a similar fashion that we have applied state aid in the past. So that sums up the totality of the decisions that you have to make. I would recommend that you make these in one chunk. We can certainly talk about each one of them, and I encourage you to ask questions. I think it would be, it might be useful if we jumped out of this attachment and went to the allocation summary so you see what the actual by-campus performance is and the dollar amounts that are affected for those who are not receiving the funds.
Regent Sheehy.
Before we jump out, I want to go back to slide 5.
Okay.
It seems like we've jimmied the numbers a little bit to figure out the metrics. And you know I don't do math after 3 in the afternoon, so bear with me. But by moving the multiplier to 0.25 from 0.5, don't we lessen the amount of points awarded for underrepresented groups?
Madam Chair, Regent Sheehy, yes, you do. And
Doesn't MSUB have a disproportionate number of non-traditional students that would benefit from this? Is that why their number moves so much?
Madam Chair, Regent Sheehy, no, they went down in those categories as well, and they were not receiving funds based upon increases in metrics related to their underrepresented groups. They lost $250,000 because it changed historically the transitional zone, the size of the transitional loss zone is calculated upon your past performance. And so it actually shrank that zone for them, and it moved them further towards the end of the transitional loss zone where they would not receive any funds. So that was the effect of the 0.25 changing from 0.5 to 2.5. It was not that they actually were receiving points for underrepresented groups, because they weren't.
Okay, gotcha.
Chancellor Nook, did you have any comment on this with regard to how you'll address this?
Yeah, a couple comments. We have built the loss of, we have built this change in the performance-based funding into our budget model for the coming year. So it's part of the 4.4. We had to estimate it. We didn't know what it would be. So this is one of those numbers that's going to move on us. But it is in what we had set up. We had a loss of performance-based funding put into that budget model. So I think we can cover this. But it's pretty difficult to handle. And we'd be in a much better place if we hadn't had to do that. It does come to, in this model, they said it's a sizable reduction in funds that we would have access to if we had hit our graduation marks and our retention marks. But as a university, we didn't. One of the things that in this model is difficult for us is that over the last several years, we've been fairly consistent in the number of graduates that we've had and the number of, and our retention rate. And that means our transitional loss zone is small. And so we don't have a lot of wiggle room there. We lose a student or two, and you know, just a quick calculation, if our retention rate is even and we hit the marks on that, and all we're talking about is losses with graduates, each graduate that we didn't confirm costs us $22,000. Okay? Now, it's very different at other campuses, right? It depends a lot on how big that transitional loss is. It depends on what that multiplying factor is, and it depends on how much you can earn back. And there are two campuses where that per student loss is over $20,000 and all the others are under 10. But it has to do with the consistency that those two campuses have had in their retention rates and in their graduation rates. And so now as we move into these declining enrollments and lower students, if we don't make them, we're going to get hit pretty hard. Those two campuses will get hit very hard per individual student.
Commissioner Christian?
Yeah, I just want to say with regard to Billings, Chancellor Nook inherited this.
Right.
And he's doing a fantastic job addressing it. But performance-based funding is driving some of the outcomes that we're talking about. Retention, I think they've got a long ways to go. And this is square in what Chancellor Nook is trying to accomplish, and very proud of the efforts underway. That's why I think this proposal that leads for some grant opportunities to help those students. I mean, Regent Krause has said this at several performance conversations in the last number of years, that we got to avoid those downward spirals, and I think that's a good example. But if we, you know, I think in some of those areas, just to be 100% candid, they've underperformed. And so if we flatten it so much that it has no bearing, then we don't have anything left. And so I think that the model is well done. I think Deputy Commissioner Trevor has put an incredible amount of time into it, as with the work group that's done it. And we have built in some ways to try to avoid those downward spirals. But I think as bad as I feel in that situation, as bad as I felt as a year ago, that's part of what performance funding is doing, and it's part of what it's trying to drive, and it is having an effect on creating the right conversations, I believe, ones that the board is interested in and ones that we've directed. And so I think this model gets to where we need to be and still allows us some options.
And I'm certainly encouraged by your leadership, and we look forward to your proposal for recovery of those funds. You had another comment, Chancellor Nook?
Just one comment. You know, this number that I just put in front of the board, that $22,000 per graduate that we don't get converted, talk about being able to light a fire under the campus, right? That's what's really important here, is that this number's big for us because we've been consistent. And it's going to be vital to our campus that we hit our retention numbers, that we hit our graduation numbers. This is in place for 2 years, right? It's really going to have, hopefully, some magic on our campus because this number is big and it brings it home. It's not like it's $3,000 or $4,000 per student. Well, you know, this becomes very personal for every individual student you're talking about. It slaps us in the face pretty badly. So we've got to take this very seriously as a campus.
So your approach is refreshing, and certainly we have to be responsive to the expectations of the legislature to show that this is actually having a meaningful impact.
Absolutely.
So thank you. Regent Williams.
I was curious, can we get a range from you of that per student number based on the size of the transitional loss zone? So Chancellor Nook was saying it's about 22,000 per student on his campus. Do you know what the bottom range of that is?
Madam Chair, Regent Williams, I can certainly calculate that, but I want to tell you right now, one of the reasons we went to the 1,000-point aggregate score is to get away from saying, if we would have got one more student, we would have got our $1 million. That was the problem with our last model, is that we actually allocated dollars directly on independent metrics. Now, at the smaller four-year campuses, they only have 2 metrics still, so you can really feel the pain on one or the other. The other campuses have 4 or 5 metrics, so you can kind of feel the balancing of that, because if you would have increased your retention, you probably wouldn't have had to worry about the $22,000 per completion. So no, I have not calculated those because it's really not internal to the model.
All right, without further comments, I would like to close this, and thank you, Deputy Commissioner Trevor. Deputy Commissioner Robinson, could you move us on to the last item of the action?
Yeah, Madam Chair, members of the board, the item G, excuse me, deals with the tuition and fee recommendations or proposed tuition schedules, proposed fee schedules that are being brought to you. If we could look at the proposed tuition summary first of all. You'll note on the left side of the summary, we have a listing of the resident tuition dollars, and as we've discussed earlier, talking about tuition freezes, most of those increases, or there are no increases, with the exception of Dawson Community College and Flathead Valley Community College in terms of their resident students. And we could certainly have President Karras respond to that in terms of the rationale for those proposed increases. On the right-hand side, you will see non-resident undergraduate students and the projected increases for particular campuses. When we talk about the tuition freeze in terms of the state appropriation is focused on appropriation for resident students, and the campuses are responsible for increasing or covering the cost related to the proportion of non-resident students with non-resident tuition. So there are proposed increases in non-resident tuition. And as you're well aware, the majority of non-resident students that we have are at MSU Bozeman and the University of Montana at Missoula. And so you can see those percentage changes in terms of proposed non-resident tuition rates. Certainly entertain any questions, or perhaps, Madam Chair, a response from President Karras regarding the community college resident tuition recommendations.
President Karras?
Madam Chair, members of the board, and I can't speak for Dawson Community College, only for Flathead Valley Community College. You'll have to talk to President Simon about their college, but our locally elected governing board always, each year, as many of you know, carefully looks at our budget and tuition and fee recommendations, and will probably be one of those extenuating circumstances that come back to you next year, possibly, with a request. But we have a process on our campus where we have a budget committee that goes through a process the budget committee is made up of faculty, staff, and students, and they make recommendations to me based on our upcoming budget year. This would be for fiscal year 16, and then We also provide an opportunity for students to comment and provide input on any tuition and fee increases that we have. So our student government had an opportunity to consider the tuition increase that was brought to them, and they supported the increase. They wanted to focus again on quality. We sent emails to every single student who was registered at Flathead Valley Community College this spring and provided them an opportunity to attend a student forum or to respond to us via email. We received only 4 responses. One student wanted to know why we were going to have an increase. 2 students requested a meeting with the Dean of Students. She connected with them and they didn't respond back to her on that. And then one said that they could not attend the forum. Then we had our student forum, which we also provide pizza, hoping that sometimes that will encourage more students to attend. We had 3 students attend that meeting, and they all supported the tuition increase. Our board has a focus on trying to, or I guess it's not a policy, but more of a process of keeping our tuition increases down. They've tried to have a practice of over the years having not more than a slight inflationary increase each year. The last 2 years, because of the growth we had between 2008 and 2010 and the way the formula worked, we were able not to have a tuition increase at all. If we had kept with that policy, we probably would be where we are now with the $4 per credit increase. For all students, or for students, that's $4 per credit and 60 cents for tuition and 60 cents for fees. We talk about dollar amounts to our students, not usually percentages. So for our students, that's a $64.40 per semester increase for all students, or $128.80 per year, which is about the cost of 1 latte or 1 beer microbrew per week that they'd have to give up. But our board's really focused on supporting students, and we know that even as low as our tuition and fees are, there are many students who may not be able to attend Flathead Valley Community College. And between the support of our foundation, who was able to award over $550,000 in scholarships this year, and payment plans we make for students in a number of other ways, that we ensure that even this $128 increase would not prevent any student from being able to attend college. Our board is very, very focused on that, and I know some of them, I think Shannon's here, some of them were here earlier today to support that as well. But I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. Any questions for President Karas? All right, seeing none.
Madam Chair, if we could move to the proposed mandatory fee increases, fee summary, just to talk about the due diligence performed by the Office of the Commissioner. We work very closely with the campuses in terms of recommendations for fee increases, and we do try to focus on beginning with the inflation rate, consumer price index. Keep in mind that when we are talking about these mandatory fees, these are not expenditure areas that are covered in any way by state appropriations. So they are, might be health insurance. We do have the student-driven fees, the associated students, et cetera, incorporated within these numbers. But we do, in our office, go over each recommendation with the campuses, and we push back in many instances. We are recommending that that the board approve this level of mandatory fee increases. Some of them might look a little bit high in terms of from a percentage standpoint when I talk about a 2% inflation rate or 3%, but they do have rationale behind them. Just a couple of examples. Montana Tech, for example, there's a 5.38% increase. That is related to a student-driven fee for renovation to the pool in their hyper center, and that the renovation work is not done, and they will not assess that. I think a $20 per semester fee, but once that renovation is done here in the next biennium, perhaps in the next fiscal year, that will be assessed. So absent that particular fee, the increase would be below 3%. Also at the Western campus, a student-driven fee connected with the Bulldog Athletic Recreation Center in terms of expanding number of access hours and additional services related to that student activities. There's a $15 increase per year related to those mandatory fees. So we've worked through the fees, and this office, the Office of the Commissioner, is recommending the approval of this level of fee increase. There is a tremendous amount of additional information as you look at the additional tab, which I don't intend to go into, but it talks about campus tuition and fee schedules, and there's specific information on each mandatory fee and the increase related to each mandatory fee and other fees in terms of particular class fees, course fees, etc. But I think in terms of the due diligence of the Office of the Commissioner, we have gone over with campuses those fee presentations, and we are comfortable that they are realistic and needed for those particular courses or mandatory fee issues.
Any questions regarding this item? Yes, Regent Williams.
I have one question and kind of an interesting observation. On most campuses, the fee to graduate went up, which is just kind of interesting because we're trying to increase graduation rates. I'm kidding. It's great. That's just fine. I did have a question about resident versus non-resident building fees. I don't think I quite understand. I saw a number of increases in non-resident building fees, and I know at MSU Bozeman it was fairly significant. I think I understand it's to keep in line with, we get commitment from the legislature to fund some of those things, and it's trying to keep that proportional. But if someone could kind of elaborate on that, I would appreciate it.
Good question.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I wonder if Vice President Least he might.
Yep.
We've had some desk. It is looking at the relationship in terms of the state contribution toward capital structures on the campuses that may not come through our normal process, but deferred maintenance funding, et cetera, and trying to balance that with the proportion of non-resident students on a particular campus.
Vice President Least.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Regent Williams. Yeah, the thought process behind this, and this has been a 4-year implementation. So prior to the last biennium, we had discussions with our students on campus and our non-resident students in particular, as well as resident students about this. In terms of the correlation between the tuition that they pay, which our tuition goes into the educational funding for the university, but the infrastructure on our campus, we didn't feel there was an equitable contribution from the non-residents. The fee for, they had an existing non-resident building fee, but it was not in line with the proportion, seeing how their parents, in most cases, are not paying taxes in Montana, et cetera. So we made that determination, did some math, and decided that we needed to have an extra $100 fee, in which we would implement over a 4-year period, $25 a year. So that's what this is for. Any other questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Is that consistent across most of the MUS campuses that they keep the tuition in line with the non-resident building fees proportionally?
Regent Williams, where we have the issue is probably more in the Bozeman campus than the Missoula campus because of the large number of non-resident students. The other campuses, the percentage of non-resident students is fairly small, so it probably doesn't make sense to address the issue in the same manner. So I think it's really probably more of a Bozeman-Missoula issue than all of the campuses.
Any further questions or comments regarding? Yes, Chair Tuss.
Yeah, Mick, I have a question. If you can go into a little bit more detail about how these fees bubble up to the Board of Regents. I think it's wonderful that we're in an environment where we're capping tuition, but if you look at some of the percent increases on these fees, it's significant. 12% in some cases. I think Western's 12% over a 2-year period. So this is still real money, and I think we need to be cognizant of that. Certainly glad about the tuition cap. That's outstanding. But we're raising additional dollars out of the pockets of Montana families and students because of this schedule in front of us. And so I just want to be very, very clear about how this hits our desk and this table in terms of what the campuses look at prior to saying, yes, this is absolutely needed?
Regent Tuss, very, very, very good question, and it's certainly the same question that I ask a number of times over the last 2 months in looking individually at these fee increases. And, it may be that the answer is not consistent across all of the campuses, but there are some of these fees where the underlying service does include wages and salaries for individuals, perhaps. And one of the issues that the campuses are working on is, okay, how do we implement or estimate the implementation of a pay plan that is based on 50 cents an hour? So when you talk about the mandatory fees and the services connected with those, many times you may be talking about individuals that might be $8 or $10 an hour employees. And so when you talk about a 50% increase, that becomes kind of a 5% increase in the individual salary. So they may be a little bit higher in this particular biennium, and that's one of the, I think one of the drivers of that fee increase, just as an example.
Commissioner Christian.
Madam Chair, Regent Tuss, and remember the conversation we had earlier, we're not having to raise tuition because the legislature put some additional funding in there, but that funding in itself amounts to about a 3 and 3 in each year. So when you put that on top of this, the fees are pretty consistent with the same increase, and that's sort of the pledge that we made to the legislature, is that we would not backfill tuition with fees. And I will tell you, Deputy Commissioner Robinson spent a tremendous amount of time on this. We had a few proposals for new fees that I think were outstanding programs. We said, no, that's not in the spirit of it. There are some outliers, but in several cases that were described, those come from some oddities, and in some cases student driven fees, and that get us maybe above that 3 and 3 kind of concept, but that's where we tried to hold the line. And many of these fee increases are actually under that or consistent with that. So I just think you got to put that as the backdrop. It's not 0 and 0, even though that's what the tuition will be. It was 3 and 3.
If there's no further comments or questions on this area, I believe we can move on to information.
Madam Chair, just a couple comments. We're providing all of the audit reports to you as board members as information. You'll notice that they all have an unmodified clean opinion, so there is nothing in those individual audit reports that we felt necessary to bring to the attention of the board. Item B in the information is really just reference material. By board policy, this is presented to the board at the May meeting each year. It provides information regarding the construction authority, construction project authority that has been approved by the Board of Regents. And so it gives you a little information about those authorities and where they stand on the campus in terms of the utilization or completion of those particular projects.
Commissioner Christian.
Madam Chair, we moved through that quickly, but I would like to say I think that's outstanding oversight by our campuses and the Commissioner's office. We've got 11 audit reports in front of you with no recommendations. I don't think I've ever seen it before. That's pretty outstanding.
Absolutely. So noted. Any questions on this item? All right, item B. You're good there? Good there. Okay. With no further questions, I would move to adjourn this session and turn it back to you, Chair Tuss.
Thank you.
Uber Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Regent Albrecht. Robust conversation. Let's move. If you have a meeting at a school that has a culinary component, we need to be fairly concise with our dinner plans. And so I just wanted to let folks know that we will be getting out of here no later than 5:15. Okay, so just to let everybody know, regardless of where we are on the agenda, we will pick up where we left off tomorrow morning. And so let's move into our staff and compensation committee. And there's a whole bunch of items here related to the consent items that I don't think will take much time. I am going to look at Dr. Shively, and do we have enough time here to get through your presentation? I want to give you the time necessary to make the time you need. Okay. So with that, and knowing that we've got those time constraints, I think I do want to turn it over for these consent items to Deputy Commissioner McRae, if you have any comments.
Mr. Chairman, I don't. You have a pretty standard looking consent agenda in front of you, and we could certainly answer questions about any of the items, but then we're ready to, after the consent agenda, move to Dr. Shively's presentation on behalf of the Coalition of Union Faculty.
Is there a desire on behalf of the committee members to move the consent agenda forward to tomorrow's action? Okay, we will do that. We are now at the information piece, and so with respect to the Coalition of Union Faculty presentation, I would certainly invite Dr. Shively from the University of Montana to approach the podium, and I know he's got a great presentation for us.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the board. I'm David Shively. I'm the president of the University Faculty Association at the University of Montana and the chair of the Coalition of Union Faculty. I'm speaking to you today in my UFA capacity, but I think that the information that I have to share will pertain to other campuses across the system. I wanted to, before I begin, thank the board for its attention today to the outcome of the legislative session. I believe that the comments that were made here certainly bear on what it is that I'm going to talk about. So this has to do with the pay plan, the general apportionment to the system. I'd also like to thank Commissioner Christian for having addressed the need to maintain quality of the system. This is a theme that I've addressed in the past, and I think you hit the nail on the head in that regard. You talked about funding constraints for the system, and quality is one of the important aspects of that. So I will begin. One of my colleagues recommended that I be professorial and use a laser pen to outline my points. But I see that there are too many targets, and I think I'll desist from that. I only brought one pen, and that I'll just have to go with that. Unless somebody has one I could borrow, perhaps. Okay. Well, if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So what I wanted to show you is a slide that you've seen a portion of before. This slide shows the average salary for faculty at different ranks in the 2013-2014 academic year. And that average salary then is compared to the average salary of faculty at peer institutions throughout the United States. And then you'll see a percent of peer average, which is the information that you saw previously. This was in the November board meeting. So what I'd like to inform you about in this regard is that the comparator institutions that are shown here, and this would be the peer institution average salary in those different ranks, these data come from approximately 50 different institutions that reported Coupa data for And these would be institutions that are classified as Carnegie High research institutions. And so the institutions are reporting salary data by discipline at these different ranks. And these are the 4-digit Coupa CIP codes that were utilized for this analysis. And this was compiled in our Office of Finance, Budgets, and Planning by administrative staff at the university. So these information, these data, are informative because they help us to see how faculty compared to other institutions that are similarly aligned last year, okay? And what you can see from this, and we've discussed before, is that the percent of peer average, and I should emphasize that this is a peer average. The average for these peer institutions is very similar to the mean. It shows the distributions are more or less normal. They generally fall, the averages, a little bit higher than the median, I guess I should say. And that shows, I guess that would indicate that there are some rather high salaries out there in the rest of the United States that tend to offset the distribution a little bit so that the mean and the median do not coincide exactly. But the peer average is an average, average is an average, and when we look at a percent of average for the faculty ranks as compared with the peers, you see that they are sitting below the average. And so for full professors, for example, we're looking at approximately the 40th percentile nationally is what we're looking at. It's not 80% from a maximum across the country, it's at the 40th percentile. You can also see that the percent of peer average declines as you move up the chart on the far right from assistant professor, which is a tenured position, to full professor. Okay, so we decline from 93.72% to 80.58%. Okay, and I'll discuss how this works in the context of the market, and we've had this discussion before, so I think it will just help to set the context for what it is that I will be talking about a little bit later. I should also point out that, as I've said in the past, retirement contributions or retirement benefit is not reflected in this. So as you see the salary percent of average decline, you're also seeing the ability for more senior faculty at the associate and professor, full professor ranks, to contribute to retirement plan declining as compared with peers across the United States. Okay, and that's very important for those faculty who are more senior, who are interested in retiring at some point in time. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So the role of the market is actually very important in producing this, what I would call a salary depression situation. And I'll talk about how salary depression might include inversions and compression in just a moment. But the market determines salaries when people are on the market and being hired. Okay, and this is typically at the more junior ranks, the assistant and associate professor ranks. And these people in these ranks, especially in a pre-tenure situation, I think I could generally say, I think my colleagues would support this idea or generalization. Folks in the assistant and associate ranks, especially before tenure, are generally more mobile. Faculty will take positions, they'll sometimes take a first position so that they secure a tenure track position. And they will have some service at a given institution that will help them to establish a professional portfolio record of performance, which helps to make them marketable elsewhere. So if they have a desire to end up in a certain place or region or institutional type, they would have had some prior service that they can then transfer to that new place of employment. And so the faculty are often more mobile and participating in the market in the more junior ranks. And you see that, from that previous slide, that our percent of peer average is declining as you move to the more senior ranks, and the market's playing a role in that. Also important, I think, is that the market rate generally increases more rapidly than what we would call our normal salary increments or the across-the-board salary increments. So the market salaries may be increasing faster than our cost of living increases, and even our promotion increments are keeping pace with. And so that helps to put us behind a little bit further as well as time goes on. Now, you'll see sometimes when we're bargaining and in our CBAs, we are addressing that by perhaps increasing the amount of contribution towards a promotion increment over time. And the question is that keeping pace with what is happening in the market? And I guess you could say that looking at the data, probably not for the most part. Now, let me also say and point out that this market situation where you have more junior faculty being hired at the market rate and slower, I guess you could say, growth in faculty salaries as rank becomes more senior can produce a situation where you have people being hired at salary levels that are very close to existing more senior faculty. And this is what begins to produce the inversion and compression problem. And if I could have the next slide, please. So inversion is a salary of a more junior faculty member that exceeds that of a more senior member, okay? And so somebody who's been at a given institution for some time, you see the market showing some upward movement, newer faculty being hired in, that market rate may end up with salary levels that are very close to or perhaps even exceed the salaries of more senior colleagues. Okay, and this can certainly happen within rank. It impacts, I guess the inversion situation can be manifested over a period of time as well, so years of service can become a factor. And that's an issue on campuses when it comes to faculty within given units in terms of morale, looking at their opportunity to have salaries that they feel are reflective of their long term of service to a given institution and their contributions. The faculty salary compression issue is an overall contraction of the salary levels between those most senior and most junior members. Okay, and so inversion might happen within those ranks, but overall you see an overall compression. And so what I would call faculty salary depression would very likely include inversion and compression, but it's also systems salary levels that are depressed relative to peer institutions across the marketplace. Next slide, please. So I thought it's instructive to discuss with you how collective bargaining fits in for those faculty that are organized into collective bargaining units. And so this flow chart attempts to describe that. It's not as colorful and eye-catching as some of the charts that you've seen here today, but it's a faculty member's attempt to show where different activities across the system are taking place. And so at the very top, on the top tier, you'll see some different inputs. Campus budgeting is that process that's undertaken by the campus units, forwarding budget snapshots forward to OCHE for compilation and integration into the budget that's submitted to the governor. Okay, so this would be campus operating expenses. It would include existing levels of salary, other sometimes compensation-related matters, but it does not include those cost of living increases that would necessarily be of interest to faculty and staff and administration. So that information would be a part of the consideration of the state appropriation bill, House Bill 2 typically, and would help to provide the system with some money to operate. Okay, and outside of that, the box on the far left shows pre-budget bargaining. This is a process that state employees engage in bargaining with the governor to determine some kind of an arrangement for compensation that would be then pushed forward to the legislature, and then you'll see what the outcome of that particular process is. In this particular legislative year, what was bargained by state employees with the governor was the 50-cent per hour pay increase and a modest increase in contribution to health insurance premiums, the employer contribution. Okay, so it's important to point out that faculty as bargaining units don't participate in that pre-budget bargaining at this particular point in time. They have in the past, from what I understand. And this is before I began to collectively bargain. Some of you have probably seen that before. I'm not going to say that it's the best thing that we have to do, but it allows for an additional process by which the faculty can engage in discussions with OCHI and the Board of Regents about compensation before the legislative process begins to operate. Okay, following this process, OCHI and Board of Regents ultimately will receive some funds from the legislature through the general appropriation and a pay plan, and then we have the tuition angle to incorporate, but we end up with the situation where OCHI and Board of Regents will ultimately determine what the allocations to the campuses will be. This will help to fund campus budgets. This becomes a part of the pot of money that faculty bargaining units are typically looking at. And I'm not here to bargain today, I'm just describing the process. I need to point out again that our MUS Montana University system benefits both in the health and retirement areas impact on overall levels of compensation as well. So if I could have the next slide, that would be terrific. So what we have is a situation where faculty, when they go to bargain, find themselves at the very end of a long, tortuous process. It involves many people in Helena over a period of about 90 days. It involves the Montana University system, visiting with those people in the Capitol building, trying to secure the general appropriation or their portion of that, trying to secure some kind of a pay plan. There's a lot of activity by a lot of different actors, and these faculty whose salaries become quite depressed with respect to peers across the rest of the country come in to bargain at the very end of that process. And it's, I guess, in a very true sense, it's not the type of bargaining that most of us would think about when we think about collective bargaining. There's a lot of constraints that we're operating with. So we've had some discussions. The CUF organization, the various faculty unions that belong to CUF, in conjunction with the Staff and Compensation Committee over the last several years about this faculty salary depression situation, how we can understand it better. These CUPA numbers give us some indication of where we happen to sit. The numbers that you saw were a little dated, but what our goal has been has been to understand the overall level of the salary depression, understand that on a campus-by-campus basis, so that we can understand how that situation, coupled with what's happening with the faculty ranks, are we recruiting and retaining the right kinds of people and the right numbers of people in the system to maintain its quality, how all of these factors interact with one another. We had some work that we had done up until about the summer of 2013. We had a little bit of work beyond that helped to produce the chart that you saw on our particular campus. Now, this was an outcome of this larger working group process, but I worked with our administrative personnel in the Office of Planning, Budgets, and Analysis to have them extract those CUPA data, so that we could analyze this situation for informational purposes. And so what we have is a situation where the numbers are constantly changing, and it would be very beneficial to understand what things look like today and what some of the trends actually look like, so that we have a better idea of the nature of the problem and what its potential pattern and trajectory might be. And so what I would propose as a solution for helping to solve the Montana University System faculty salary depression problem is that we resume that work. And we've talked about that here before. I think that we've had the indication from OCHI and the board that they're amenable to having these discussions, and we'd like to get back to work doing that on each of the campuses so that we can have a better understanding of what the needs for the system are to improve the situation with regard to the overall depression, also the inversion and compression. So that would be my first suggestion as in terms of a solution for this particular problem. I think it's important to, once we understand what the situation is, not treat this as just an exercise, but to ultimately establish some kinds of goals and some kinds of plan that we can hopefully follow to address the problem. Now, the problem could be addressed in a number of different ways. It would very likely be the kind of a problem that, like other problems, you can't solve all at once. It takes some time. And so I would suggest that establishing a set of goals and ultimately a timeline by which we can hopefully achieve those goals would be a valuable exercise. Part of this might involve a return to pre-bargaining. It's certainly not something that would hurt in this particular regard. It takes a little bit more time, but if we have some more information to work with in this regard, it might be useful. So it's something to certainly consider. As a faculty member, and I've talked to other members, and these would be people involved in collective bargaining units, we sometimes feel that when pre-bargaining is happening between state employees and the governor, and we're not involved in a pre-bargaining process with the university system per se, that we don't really have the opportunity to have this overall issue of our profession and our levels of compensation addressed at the front end. And I think that the pre-bargaining allows that to happen to some extent. Doesn't mean that everybody will get what they want, but it is conversation that's happening earlier in the process, and we're able to come to some kind of terms about what our particular problems are. So it might follow very well with the idea of examining the issues, establishing goals, and setting a timeline. And then, if we're successful at some point in carving out some space from these limited funds, I mean, we're talking rocks and hard places, but understanding that perhaps there's some flexibility or some additional funds that come into the system, the question arises, well, how do we ultimately begin to address the problems with some monetary fixes? And I guess I have to say that, on my campus, we've actually established a pool that helps us to deal with the inversion compression problem, which is very useful. And we bargained for that, and that's a mechanism that could be considered across the system. Establishing a designated pool doesn't have to be a pool that will solve the problem all at once, but perhaps over a period of time that will allow us to make some progress in that regard. And I believe that the board has the authority to do that. As we've heard some discussions today about board authority in different respects with decision-making processes, control and authority to designate budgets is one of those items. And so I think it would be worthwhile for the board, for OCHI, and for representatives of faculty bargaining units to have that discussion at some point in time. So that's what I had to say to you. I hope I didn't take too much time. I think we have some left. It's not 5:15, but we have a few minutes for questions, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Shively. I'll open it up for questions. Regent Sheehy.
Dr. Shively, I don't want to speak for Bill Johnstone, but I'm really sorry he's not here because this is his number one priority. He's expressed it at many meetings, and today was mentioning to us that he would very much like to make this one of the priorities of what we do in the next year. And I totally agree with him, and I totally agree with you. Who could do the assessment is my first question, and do you have a vision for how this could work? Because I think we need a timeline, I think we need goals and measurable metrics, and I think we need to stop talking and start doing something about the inversion and compression. You know, this is the first time I've understood about the market. I never really figured out how we got to the inversion and compression, and now I do. So you've made great progress with me. And now let's talk about, if you have any idea about an assessment mechanism, I would love to hear it, and a timeline is something I'm very interested in.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, Regent Sheehy, thank you very much for that. I can chalk that up as a win in that just like Associate Commissioner Trevor got through to somebody today, which is always a goal. We had an effort, as I said, that progressed through a couple of individual meetings. We'd formed, these were joint faculty and administration groups that formed on the various campuses to tackle this issue. What is the extent of the problem? How do we measure it? And one of the groups, the committee, actually was tasked with identifying data sets that would allow us to do that in a consistent manner across the campus units. And so we had largely settled on the Coupa data for that purpose, but had not progressed to the point where we could begin to analyze those data to determine what the overall level of depression was. Okay, so that was work that one group did. Another group that I was a part of was actually tasked with developing some models that could be used in case we ever were successful in reaching a goal of securing some funds that could be distributed for market or salary depression and built into that inversion and compression. And the model that we looked at was very much, it was based on what MSU Billings has been doing for some period of time. It looked like an acceptable model. We weren't able to take things to the point where we were able to make some kind of a definitive decision. Here we are, we've got the data set, we've got a model, let's begin to crunch some numbers. We didn't get to that point, but I think we could very easily go back to that effort. We have some distractions sometimes. We have some budgetary distractions, we have some legislative distractions, we have performance-based funding which arose, we have all kinds of things. So it takes some diligence, but I think for the most part, the bargaining unit is very interested in going back to that work, and then having some discussions in that process about what some goals could be and what kind of a timeline we could establish. But it's difficult work to get committees together, especially committees comprised of faculty and administrators and others from across the system and from Helena in the commissioner's office. So.
May I follow up?
Please.
A long time ago, I was a member of the State Bar Montana Board, and we were dealing with judicial salaries and watching our judges suffer in respect to everyone around our region. And it took a lot of work, but I heard on the radio the other day, just yesterday in fact, that the solution we came up with is a working, viable, still working solution, which is every so often, I can't remember the period of years, we measure these surrounding areas, we take an average of that, and we force ourselves to pay our judges that average. We committed to it, we came up with the formula, we came up with the rubric, and that's now been going on for 10 years, and our judges are climbing to a very respectable salary and comparable to neighboring states. So I'm not saying that's the solution, but I'm saying that if we start and if we come up with something, we may be able to do something. There is hope for this situation, despite the fact that I've only been on here a year. It seems like this is the depressing, no pun intended, problem, and we got to get on it.
Mr. Chair, Regent Sheehy, if I might ask a question of you. Was there concern that judges would, that the state would have a difficult time recruiting competent and qualified judges?
Absolutely, because our judiciary is elected, This
Yes.
was a state judiciary problem.
Yes.
And so in addition to the problem of the salary, they had to pay to run.
Well, right.
And so, you know,
Right.
there were many problems with
There's
how it
additional
worked.
dynamics
Yeah.
involved. Yeah.
But no, yeah, absolutely, the quality of the judiciary was our chief concern, because you cannot retain good people when they can go to Wyoming and make more.
Regent Robinson.
Thank you, Chair Tuss. Dr. Shively, I was wondering if what you're proposing as far as next steps and putting together a plan of this nature and having some discussions, do you see this as being any conflict with the bargaining units and superseding any of that? Because I just don't want us to go down an avenue that seems to be in conflict with that, because obviously we don't want to do that.
Mr. Chair, Regent Robinson, I appreciate the question. It is a question that has been asked before. We engaged in our first activity, I guess I could call it, with that question in mind. And the ultimate solution is to, you know, what would happen were the resources to become available to help us address this problem? How would that be approached? And I think that would be a part of the renewed discussions that we would have to have. CUF as an organization was participating in this exercise of understanding the salary situation. CUF does not have authority to bargain for the various bargaining units. And so it is more of an academic exercise in concept, but I believe that there is the opportunity to address the issue across the system. Each campus has a slightly different situation, but we're all relatively similar in that we all basically have some depressed levels of salary. And so it seems that a system solution would be very important to try to address. It still begs the question, how would collective bargaining work in that kind of a context? And I'm not exactly sure, but I think it's a discussion that we could have. And there are, for example, some aspects of compensation that do not involve collective bargaining. Some of that has to do with legislative appropriation for benefits, and that's out of our control, but proposals made in pre-bargaining could perhaps help us to address that. And the same would be for the retirement system. A fix to our Montana University retirement plan, where the employer level of contribution is lower than that of the employee, which makes us an oddity around the country, would be a step in that right direction as well. So those are potential aspects of a solution that could be entertained by a collective group of faculty and administrators and OCHI staff in the near future, and we'd enjoy at least having the conversation.
Commissioner Christian, I know that we are very close to the bewitching hour here, but we have done, I'm assuming that the office has done some of this work to date. Can you quickly explain that, and then maybe we can pick this up tomorrow morning?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we've ever talked about this, that we don't know for certain this is the #1 priority of the system. And I think I've been asked a number of times what's the biggest threat to our existence, and this is it. I mean, there's no question about it. Boards change, times change, representatives change. 2007, I was chair of staff and comp. We put together a recruitment retention task force, spent a lot of time on this, came up with some great solutions. Went to the legislature, asked for a pool of money to address this, got turned down quite sharply. And since then, we reconstituted that task force a few times, and we can do that. And, you know, I always sort of err between, I don't want to frustrate people when we don't have resources to do it and just provide rhetoric. I think this pooling thing that Dr. Shively provided or explained is sort of the outcrop of that. We couldn't get a legislative pool, which is what we asked for. And so we've tried to establish some pool at various campuses to address it as we can. But there's nothing that was said here that I don't just adamantly agree with, and that is the biggest challenge we have in front of us. Everyone sitting here at the table realizes it takes resources to solve this, and We can reallocate those funds. We can do all kinds of things. We just have to try to find that balance. And what is the right timeline? I think Regent Johnstone's made it very clear, and I couldn't agree more. This is a high priority. I guess I do want to say it has been a high priority of the board, probably no higher priority. The tuition increase, the last one that was done in the system, came in a legislative session in 11 when there was no increases at the state level. And we simply said that won't work for us. So we raised tuition to do a modest pay increase. And so, you know, we have addressed it, but we need to continue to do that. And if we feel like some further conversations or reconstituting the recruitment and retention group is productive time, some of that will get us back to where we already know we're at, which is what you presented today. We're behind the curve and we need to figure out how to fix it. But those conversations are productive as long as they're not frustrating people on both sides of the table, that we're talking about the same things. I think they're a very good idea. We can continue to try to work on this, and I think we've got to explore system-wide a better use of sort of the pooling to address these problems. And I know no higher priority on the campuses whatsoever than this item.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Dr. Shively. I'd like to pick this up tomorrow morning, even if it's very briefly, to make sure that we've kind of covered the waterfront in terms of questions or comments that we have on this. This is important, and I don't want to leave this, and so, but I know that we do need to get on with our business this evening. So let's recess right now and come back tomorrow morning. Thank you so much for this presentation.
Thank you. I'll look forward to seeing you in the morning.